Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Shatter the Nations, ISIS and the War for the Caliphate by Mike Giglio. This is from the prologue. Dateline, Mosul, Iraq, February 2017. Abdul Wahab swore it was a true story. His eyes were reflected in the rearview mirror as he sped his pickup through battle-beaten country. To the left, the setting sun cast a Polaroid haze across brown fields and squat stone farmhouses. To the right was a ridge of mountains. Ahead was a flat road and a darkening sky. There was a soldier, a big soldier named Will. That's how Abdul Wahab put it. He pronounced the name Wool. Wool, Wool. He said it a couple more times, like he hadn't said it in a while. He slowed the truck to roll through the final checkpoint manned by the Kurdish militia, whose green and red flags snapped in a bitter wind. A soldier in a scarf manned a machine gun on the barricade that marked the boundary. From there, the road led 60 miles through territory controlled by the Iraqi military to the edge of Mosul and the last bastions of the ISIS caliphate. Will was one of the American Special Forces sent to Iraq more than a decade earlier to kill insurgents. The nights of the Iraq War had been filled with U.S. commando raids, and the Americans had created Abdul Wahab's elite battalion to do the raids with them, an Iraqi version of the Delta Force, or SEAL Team 6. The battalion had an English name, the Iraqi Counterterrorism Force, and was known by its initials, ICTF, which the men sewed onto their uniforms and painted on their Humvees. The Iraqis admired their American mentors. They picked up the Special Forces ethos, wore baseball caps and sunglasses, used words like the F word and bro and dude. But Will was different, Abdul Wahab said. He would lose control. Abdul Wahab kept his foot on the gas pedal as he raced through a Christian town that seemed to be empty. ISIS had destroyed some of the houses, and the ones still standing were dark. Not a soul was visible except a trio of Iraqi soldiers who sat on a leather couch on the roadside. The photographer, Warzar Jaf, was in the passenger seat. I was in the back. Abdul Wahab's M16 was by my feet. An ICTF veteran in his 40s who had given up fighting, Abdul Wahab had been ferrying Jaf and me to and from Mosul for months. He was stocky and gruff and expert at passing through the myriad checkpoints that led to the front lines, always knowing what to say or whom to call or when to gift his sunglasses to an admiring militiaman. He was an ideal wheelman for navigating the strange tapestry of the alliance, with all its varied forces flying their banners around the city like armies in a medieval siege. His commanders used him for special transport of weapons and supplies, and officers who wanted to escape for a night to the hotels of Erbil, the Kurdish capital and nearest outpost of modernity, a place where they could find a decent dinner and booze, or visit a mall or swim in a pool, and grasp at a moment of normalcy on the edge of the world's most brutal war zone. As grumpy as Sharon, he was forever making the 45-mile journey between the two valley cities, and when Jaf and I had no other way to get to the war, we went with him. A folk song about an old battle was playing on the radio. You made your tribe proud of you, I can hear them scream. Abdul Wahab was still talking about Will. First he began shooting animals on patrol. Then on a raid one night he shot an old man as he opened his front door. Abdul Wahab had seen it happen, said he'd seen it happen. The man's daughter was screaming, beating her chest in grief, and Will said something like, I just gave him an injection, he's sleeping, and threw a mattress onto the old man. He killed a teenager in front of his mother, jamming his gun into the boy's mouth. Abdul Wahab said he saw the boy's mangled head. He killed one man as Iraqi medics were treating him. He killed another while he lay in bed beside his wife. I asked what had happened to Will. Abdul Wahab said he didn't know. Will was transferred one day, and that was the last he'd seen of him, but he reckoned that a man like him must have met his judgment eventually. What he was telling me I knew was a ghost story. It reminded me of old reports of torture and orange jumpsuits and dead civilians, and that what America asked of its soldiers could unhinge them. The war that defined my parents' generation in Vietnam had the draft and civil unrest with it. By the time the Iraq War started, when I was 18, America had a volunteer army, so people like me could carry on without worrying that our number would be called. The country still found itself with a guilty conscience, though, and in this war with ISIS, the only U.S. soldiers on the front lines were the secret kind, small groups of commandos whose every mission was classified, while U.S. pilots and drone operators dropped bombs. It was left to local soldiers, like the men of Abdul Wahab's battalion, to do the bulk of the fighting, And as far as most Americans and their politicians were concerned, the war was out of sight and out of mind. In a way, it made sense. Fewer Americans lost their lives or their minds or committed war crimes. There were fewer stories like Will's. Yet, in this new kind of U.S. war that culminated in Mosul, the deadliest urban battle in which America had engaged in at least half a century, the toll was still being paid by the local soldiers who were U.S. allies and by the civilians who were dying by the thousands in the crossfire. And I worried about the psyche of a country that still considered itself at war, but was more disengaged than ever from it, with no sense of shared sacrifice or even collective responsibility. On the one hand, America seemed obsessed with ISIS, roiling with every terror attack, while on the other, they made little effort to understand the enemy or the local soldiers doing most of the killing and dying to stop it. The book Shatter the Nations. Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And happy Monday. Thom Hartmann here with you. What a beautiful rainy day. It's actually, fall is here. It's a peak autumn in the Pacific Northwest, which is really great. The Supreme Court just struck down a lower court ruling. This was from the three-judge panel in Michigan, in the Eastern District of Michigan, ruled back in April that 34 of Michigan's state voting districts had been specifically designed, their language, specifically designed to disadvantage Democratic voters, deliberately diluting the power of their vote to ensure a particular partisan outcome. They called this a pernicious practice that undermines our democracy. So this went to the Supreme Court, and John Roberts, in this was a 5-4 decision. Conservatives all said gerrymandering in Michigan is just fine, and the 4 liberals were like, this shouldn't be happening. This is violates democracy. Elena Kagan wrote just an absolutely rip them a new one response to this, saying, I think it's important to underscore that fact. The majority disputes none of how gerrymanders undermine democracy. In other words, all the Republicans agree. Yes, gerrymanders undermine democracy. In fact, she continues, indeed, the majority concedes, really, how could it not, that gerrymandering is incompatible with democratic principles. And she said this in the bench, right, which means that she was like really punching this stuff out. And I mean, this is the power of the Supreme Court. This is the power of living in this constitutional monarchy. And you can say, well, this was the will of the people, was it not? It was the vote in Michigan. No, it was the will of the billionaires who had basically, poured enough money in to get these Republicans elected in Michigan. I mean, I grew up in Michigan. I know the politics there pretty well. And that was facilitated by the Supreme Court, too, in striking down laws that Congress had passed in the 1970s that controlled money in politics. And now you've got Amazon funding a campaign in Seattle as a consequence of a Supreme Court decision that made this possible, right? Or a series of Supreme Court decisions. Buckley, First National Bank, Citizens United, McCutcheon. These Supreme Court decisions saying money is speech. Oh yeah, it's just free speech. It's all good, So if Amazon doesn't like a socialist on the city council in Seattle, they can put $1.5 million into the campaign and just blow her away. This is a mind-boggling amount of power in the hands of 9 people who are not elected. I mean, as you know, I've got a new book out about this, the hidden history of the Supreme Court and the betrayal of America. And here we have, the betrayal of America again by the court. And if the court is going to have this kind of power, and frankly, I doubt that that's going to change. If the court is going to have this kind of power, then when Democrats get control of the House, the Senate, and the White House, they need to expand the court. They need to pack the court. We need to go back to FDR days. But this is just breaking news, and I suppose we shouldn't be surprised. The Supreme Court is just fine with our democracy being hijacked by billionaires. After all, most of the majority of the people on the Supreme Court are the toadies of billionaires. 5 out of the 4 of them, or 5 out of the 9 of them. Meanwhile, I want to talk, and I suppose, feel free to, if you want to talk about the Supreme Court and the role of the court and all that kind of stuff, feel free to give us a shout. But I want to talk also about war and peace, and about the future of war in the world, and about what's something called democratic peace theory that you may not have heard of. And I think that this is really actually a very big deal. Back in 1795, yeah, 1795, this is, America has won the Revolutionary War. George Washington is president. And Immanuel Kant, the philosopher, the German philosopher, writes this piece, it wasn't quite a book, it was like a long pamphlet. It was called Toward Perpetual Peace, a philosophical draft. I won't even try the German. And in this, he said that we could end war for all time. Now, keep in mind, this was right at America. We weren't literally the first democracy ever. You had the Greek democracies, and you had the some parts of the Roman Empire were democracies, but we were arguably, and there had been, in the Low Countries and in the Netherlands and what we now call the Netherlands, and some other areas, there had been some countries that had kind of put themselves together in a democratic fashion. But we were the giant experiment for the world. I mean, the vast majority of people in the world figured that, there's no way that democracy can work. I mean, you can't trust the people. After all, we've had kings for 2,000 years. We've had popes, running things. Basically warlords and all that's very stable. I mean, feudalism was, 1,400 years in Europe. It's so isn't that the way things are supposed to be? Immanuel Kant said no. And his point was that if every country in the world became a democracy, where the will of the majority of the people was actually carried out. Now, you could argue, by the way, that America is no longer a democracy because the will of the people is no longer carried out. Well, this was this shocking study from Gillens and Page a while back that found that the probability of legislation being passed that the top 1% wants is really, really high. Probability of legislation being passed that the bottom 90% wants is equivalent to random noise. That means that we're post-democracy. We've become an oligarchy or plutocracy. But that, let's set that aside for a minute and let's just talk, because I think that I still hold hope. I mean, I think that the 2020 election next November is going to be when we're going to find out whether democracy is going to survive in the United States and around the world. And if it doesn't, it's going to lead to war. So anyhow, what Kant was saying was that if you've got two countries next door to each other and they're both democracies, even if they've got all kinds of conflicts, as long as one doesn't attack the other, well, one would never attack the other as long as they're both controlled by their people. Because, I mean, just very, very simply, no majority of citizens would ever vote to send their own children off to die unless their country had been attacked. So you would have no wars of aggression coming out of democracies. And if everybody else was a democracy, it literally would end all war for all time. Kant proposed this in 1795. Thomas Paine picked this up in 1798. Ben Franklin was writing about this. Actually before that, although he didn't have Kant's rant, but Ben Franklin wrote "All wars are folly," and there never was a good war or a bad peace. I mean, he was very, very, very much opposed to most wars. Although the American Revolution, of course, was a war. This is why in the Constitution, when they drafted the Constitution, the power to declare war is exclusively given to Congress and has to begin in the House of Representatives. which is elected, the entire body, all of the House of Representatives is elected. Every single one of them is up for re-election every 2 years. The idea was this will put an end to war. Woodrow Wilson embraced this so aggressively that he called World War I the war to end all wars, because it was to reestablish democracy in Europe. In 1962, a research scientist from New York called Dean Babst, by the name of Dean Babst, found that he studied 116 wars that involved 438 countries. And he wrote, and I quote, "No wars have been fought between independent nations with elective governments between 1789 and 1941. Now, he was counting Germany as an elective government. You could point out, though, that by 1941, Germany was no longer an elective government. Hitler had banned opposition parties in the free press. So I'd say, you know, to this day, David Singer and Melvin Small wrote a book called Resort to Arms, International and Civil Wars 1816 to 1980. And they defined a war as something that produced more than 1,000 deaths in battle. Not one was fought between two democracies. Professor Randolph Rummel, using the similar definition of war, 1,000 casualties, looked at 353 pairs of nations that had engaged in battle between 1816 and 1991. He found that dictatorships fought each other in 198 of the 353 wars. Democracies fought against non-democracies in 155 wars. But he was, quote, unable to find evidence of any war between two fully functioning democracies. Jack Levy, the author of a book called Causes of War, said, quote, the absence of war between democracies comes as close to anything as an empirical law in international relations. And then it goes beyond war to famine. Amartya Sen, who is a Nobel Prize-winning economist, in his book Development as Freedom, writes, no famine has ever taken place in the history of the world in a functioning democracy, which led Per Ahlmark, the former deputy, he's now deceased, deputy prime minister of Sweden, addressing the European Parliament to say, again, the crucial factor is freedom. Where there is an active opposition and a free press, governments cannot neglect tens of thousands of people starving to death. He said, since the last century, citizens of liberal democracies have imagined or felt these connections to be true. Now the peace researchers have confirmed our convictions. So today my report to the liberal democracies of Europe is that you have been right about freedom the whole time. But what's Trump doing? He's embracing countries that have rejected democracy. Even, formerly democratic, he's embracing the leaders that, Modi in India and Duterte in the Philippines and Orban in Hungary and Erdogan in Turkey. He's rejecting the Kurds in northern Syria that actually established a secular democracy to govern themselves. He's embracing dictatorship. He's building, for God's sake, this is, as president, I'm quoting here, as President Trump has met with leaders of at least 10 countries where he has a property or is developing one. He has also met with leaders of 3 countries, China, Saudi Arabia, and South Korea, where, hang on just a second.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Where state-owned companies are developing Trump resorts, new Trump resorts in China, in South Korea, and in Saudi Arabia. This is not democracy. And welcome back. Jason in Winter Haven, Florida. Hey, Jason, what's on your mind? Thank you for watching Free Speech TV. What's up?
Good afternoon. Yes, I love it. I'd like to say the Gilded Age, it was workers had it better then because it's not as bad now where, the rich are just getting richer, the poor get poorer, and Amazon and all these other companies can buy up politicians and robed on the Supreme Court say, that's okay, do whatever you like.
Well, that was largely true during the Gilded Age. That was what led directly to the antitrust laws. The Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890 was a direct consequence of the Gilded Age excesses of the 1880s and 1890s. And then, of course, that led to the Tillman. This led to Teddy Roosevelt and trust busting and William Howard Taft. 2 Republican progressive presidents who broke up all these giant corporations. We've been here before. Is that your point, Jason?
Yeah, we've been here before, but we don't have nowhere near a progressive Republican anywhere in that party anymore.
Right.
Scott and Trump and all them, nowhere near progressive.
Yeah.
Nope.
Yeah, well, I get that, but at the time, there were not a lot of progressives in the Democratic Party. Actually, they were mostly Republicans. The Democrats were the party of the racist South back in the 1910. At the time of Teddy Roosevelt, which is why it took a Republican in the Republican Party to do that. But
True.
But the challenge to this corporate power to say that that Facebook is going to decide who our next president is, and now it's come out that Pete Buttigieg is hiring people based on recommendations coming from the CEO of Facebook for his campaign. I mean, really? It's like we've got now a corporate candidate too. It's bizarre. It's absolutely bizarre. Jason, thanks a lot for the call. Yeah, good talking to you. I think you're absolutely right, and it raises a whole bunch of questions like, what can we do about this? Particularly when the Supreme Court says, "Oh, it's all good." Right? Will this be resolved by an election? Do you think that it's possible that the election of 2020 will be enough to restore democracy to the United States? To the extent that we're no longer a democracy, or to the extent that our democracy has been dramatically, tragically, terribly damaged? If so, which candidates do you think are actually going to work to restore democracy? I mean, I was just complaining a moment ago about Buttigieg hiring people from the based on recommendations from the CEO of Facebook. But on the other hand, Pete Buttigieg has come right out and said that one of his top priorities would be rolling back Citizens United. And Citizens United is one of these, it's one of these incredibly pernicious influences that have led to essentially, the destruction of American democracy, I think, in many ways. So, and of course, Citizens United didn't come out of nowhere. It started in 1976 with the Buckley decision, and then, of course, corporate personhood. Go back to the late 19th century, and bring that forward. And that doctrine has been evolving over the years. And again, this is all stuff brought to us courtesy of the Supreme Court. Thank you very much. So, is Trump the catalyst for war and authoritarianism around the planet? I would say yes. How do we best respond to this? With democracy, in my opinion. Which raises the question, what would your priorities be for restoring democracy in the United States? We'll be right back. It's 22 minutes past the hour. Welcome back. 23 minutes past the hour. Thom Hartmann here with you. I spent the weekend researching the stuff that I just shared with you, and I wrote it up as an op-ed piece that'll probably be published in the next day or three. And I'm kicking around the idea of even incorporating this stuff, this whole concept, into a book about democracy. And I find it absolutely fascinating that democracies don't go to war with each other. Now, this democratic peace theory is actually fairly controversial. In the 80s and 90s, it was used, the idea that democracies don't go to war with each other. This actually, in 2002, that theory was used by George W. Bush and Dick Cheney to justify the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, saying if we take over these countries and we turn them into democracies, because democracies don't go to war with each other, we will bring peace to the Middle East. Now, the problem is you can't impose a democracy, right? But that democratic peace theory was actually used to justify two wars, two illegal wars. So there's that. The other argument that's been made against the democratic peace theory is that the reason democracies don't go to war with each other is not because they're both democracies and therefore, and by the way, they're defining democracies as countries where the will of the majority of the people is what happens, where you have multiple political parties, including opposition parties, and where you have a free press. And so the second argument, and it's kind of an argument against democratic peace theory that was adopted by neoliberals, including the DLC, the whole, from Bill Clinton to George Herbert Walker Bush and Ronald Reagan, they were all saying the same thing, is that it's not that democracies don't go to war with each other because people won't vote for war. It's the reason democracies don't go to war with each other is because they have shared interests. They trade with each other. And therefore, if you want to have peace in the world, you have to have world trade. And this was the sales pitch that Reagan and Bush the Elder and Bill Clinton brought to us, and that was continued by George W. Bush and Barack Obama. In fact, with the whole TPP, was that you don't have to have democracies. If you don't want to have a war with China, just trade with them a lot. And you'll never have a war with them. Now, I think, time is telling us that that's a false theory, just like Bush and Cheney's theory that you could, bomb Iraq and Afghanistan into democracy and therefore they would become peaceful, was a false theory. And what that leaves us with is Immanuel Kant's original theory of the democratic peace theory. But in this context, to the extent that Donald Trump is promoting authoritarianism around the world, he's embracing people who are rejecting democracy or have already rejected democracy, like El-Sisi in Egypt, or Erdogan in Turkey, or Putin in Russia, or in China, Chairman Xi, or President Xi, I guess his title is now. That by embracing these people and also by the United States no longer operating under democratic principles, that is to say, the will of the majority does not get made into law in the United States. And the Supreme Court just made that situation worse, and I would say that the Supreme Court is the main reason why this is the case, that we have been corrupted by billionaires and big corporations because the Supreme Court changed the rules of the game. They moved the goalposts. So is Trump the catalyst for war and authoritarianism around the planet?
To the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
What do you think about the democratic peace theory? How do we bring this about? Is it too late in the United States? What do you think is going to happen with the 2020 elections? With regard to this, is this last call for peace on earth? In our book club today, our book is Border Wars, Inside Trump's Assault on Immigration by Davis and Scheer. This is from the prologue on page 5. Donald John Trump never meant for a giant wall across the entire southwest border to be the totem of his presidential campaign or the icon of his presidency. And he certainly never thought it would be the omnipresent reminder of his biggest frustrations in the White House. But it's because of all those things and the story of how it did, but it became all those things. And the story of how it did is the story of Trump's assault on immigration. Conceived of almost by accident out of political expediency and sheer marketing powers, the wall perfectly captured the us versus them spirit that animated Trump's candidacy, became a symbol of the same working class disaffection and sense of alienation that he had first tapped into by questioning Barack Obama's birthplace. For a politically inexperienced president who is untethered from any particular ideology, the wall was a centering force, an organizing principle for his promises. He would fix what was broken in the country. And what better symbol of America's problems than a deeply dysfunctional immigration system that had become a third rail of politics, too charged for either party to touch? Trump vowed to cut through all that, a Manhattan developer who would take a figurative hammer and nail to the task. In doing so, he would gleefully raise a middle finger to political correctness and to the Republican establishment that was looking for ways to appeal to Hispanic voters. And while he was at it, Trump would fan the flames of fear and insecurity by promising to wall off the United States from the threats he imagined were just across the threshold, the them who looked and sounded different from us. Was it racism, nativism, xenophobia? Trump and those who knew him best swore that it was not. But Trump's instincts clearly tended toward bigotry, the belief that foreigners were a threat and the native-born Americans were inherently more deserving. And his agenda held deep appeal to white supremacists and others who had felt shut out of politics in America for years, chastised for their views and obsessed with an agenda of racial purity. The appeal for Trump was much simpler and more basic. He was a marketing genius, a branding maven, and fear of the other, he discovered at his campaign rallies, sells like gangbusters. It worked as well on audiences in places like Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, whose once thriving industrial manufacturing workers felt displaced and distraught, as it did in states on the border with Mexico that had been profoundly changed by immigration and immigrants. But as potent a campaign message as the wall became for Trump, and as strong as its gravitational pull grew after he left office or took office, it also stood as a symbol of everything that plagued his immigration policy. It reflected Trump's fixation with ideas that had political power, but were often impossible to implement. His ever-changing dictates about its dimensions and materials were the most concrete examples of the whims of a fickle and deeply insecure president who always grasped for the solution that looked toughest. He pursued the wall over the objections of the career public servants who always knew that a wall was not the solution, just as he would disregard their advice and legal counsel on so many other immigration matters. It was a one-dimensional approach to a complex problem, in large part based on his own ignorance. His determination to build the wall over the objections of Congress reflected his cavalier approach to the law, which invited court challenges at every turn. The years-long war he waged over the wall revealed a bundle of contradictions that was Trump himself, a resident of one of the most diverse cities on the planet who married 2 immigrants but was hostile to outsiders. A businessman enamored of cheap and readily available labor who pressed for cuts to legal immigration. A self-styled master negotiator who could not cut a deal with Congress on immigration to save his life. Build that wall was the incessant soundtrack of Trump's frenzied campaign rallies. But once in office, he discovered that doing so was an operational, legislative, and legal quagmire that would swallow up his political capital and leave him deeply frustrated. It was a pattern that played out on every level of Trump's immigration agenda. His Muslim ban was an early indication of how the rush to fulfill his campaign promises could sow chaos and spark court challenges. Plotted in secret because Trump's advisors were certain deep state bureaucrats would kill it in the cradle, the travel order embodied the president's approach. Propose something outrageous, divisive, and potentially illegal. Watch your political opponents lose their minds criticizing it. Ask questions and provide policy rationales later. Trump's decision to end protections for dreamers, the undocumented young immigrants who have been brought into the United States as young children, set the stage for months of fighting with Congress and revealed his conflicting instincts, a desire to be seen as compassionate even as he disparaged S-hole countries in Africa and unleashed bare-knuckled tactics on immigrants. His decision to separate migrant children, some just a few months old, from their parents at the border, pointed up profound conflicts inside his administration. Some had warned of the dire consequences of a plainly cruel tactic, while others argued that it was the only effective way to deter a horde of migrants from rushing the border. It was one of the only times that Trump retreated under pressure, unwilling to endure a backlash that included members of his own family. And a curious thing, perhaps predictable in retrospect, happened as Trump's immigration crackdown unfolded throughout the country. An actual crisis, different but no less urgent than the one he was constantly warning Americans about, began to develop and worsen at the border. Border Wars by Davis and Shear. Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. So the upside, the positive news, the really actually exciting, fascinating, boy, we really need to know this news, is that democracies rarely go to war with each other. Now, there is a Wikipedia page specifically called Democracies That Went to War with Each Other, or something close to that. But, I spent a lot of time with it yesterday, and it seems like most of the things that it was describing were things like, when Yugoslavia started breaking apart and individual, what ultimately became republics, declared independence, and then there would be a war, which was sort of like the American Civil War. And I couldn't find where any two democracies actually voted essentially to have a non-defensive war with each other, or a non-defensive, to be the aggressor. Functioning democracies. So the good news is that Kant may well be right. Now, keep in mind, right up until the 1870s, there were not more than 6 or 8 democracies in the world. By 1980, half the people who lived on this planet lived in a democracy. It was fully 30% of all countries. It's now over 40% of countries, although it has declined by 3% in the last 10 years, the number of democracies. And the number of non-democracies has gone up by about 4.5% in the last decade. And why is that? This was the first reversal, by the way, in like 60 years. Why is that? I think it's because this doctrine that money is speech, and this is the bad news, this doctrine that money is speech is free speech, and therefore billionaires should be able to control politicians, own politicians, and own media, and the whole neoliberal thing of deregulate and if Thatcherism, Reaganism has actually spread across the world. And as countries adopt these policies, they become progressively less small d democratic, as in the will of the people being acted out in the legislative square. Today, you could argue that in the United States, we are very undemocratic, or we are radically less than fully democratic, because so rarely is the will of the people carried out. Now, it's possible that could change in November of next year. If the Democrats overwhelmingly take the House, the Senate, and the White House, and if we elect a progressive, or actually, frankly, I'm increasingly thinking, I mentioned earlier, Pete Buttigieg is being criticized for hiring people at the recommendation of the CEO of Facebook for his campaign. But on the other hand, he has come right out and said if he gets elected, one of the big things he's going to champion is ending Citizens United. I don't know how committed he is to that, but my sense of it is that any of the Democratic candidates they're all realizing, they're looking at the Supreme Court, they're looking at the situation, they're looking at the big money, they're looking at what the Kochs are doing, they're looking at Amazon taking down, trying to take down a city council member in Seattle, for God's sake. They're looking at this stuff and going, this can't stand. But I think this may be our last chance. And if the United States doesn't return to small d democratic principles, to the idea of actually doing what the people want Social Security strengthened. We've seen every Republican administration since Reagan weaken Social Security. The people want Medicare expanded. We've seen every Republican administration since Reagan take a bite out of Medicare. The people want clean air and clean water. We've seen every Republican administration since Reagan passing legislation allowing more pollution. Now, the Democratic Party has been on the opposite side of every single one of those battles. But because the Supreme Court welcomed big money into the political sphere in the United States, the Republican Party has gained so much power in the individual states. This has been built from the grassroots up through ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, through the Something States Network, through all these front groups that the Kochs are funding, and the Bradley Foundation, and the Mercers, and these other right-wing, Shelley Adelson, all these right-wing billionaires, that our democracy is hanging by a thread. And if our democracy goes, if we go the way of Turkey, or the way of Hungary, actually, I think is probably more likely, where Viktor Orban finally succeeded. He got enough of a constitutional majority, or a parliamentary majority, that he was actually able to rewrite the Constitution of Hungary to do away with the protections of the free press. And then he had his buddies buy up all the media outlets in the country. And so all the major media outlets in Hungary are basically Orban TV, Orban newspaper, Orban radio. And the oligarchs in the United States have got us halfway there. We've got a television network owned by a billionaire, Rupert Murdoch. You've got another television network, NBC, owned by Comcast, right-wing, which is owned by a right-wing family. You've got, in large part, I mean, all of this stuff kind of is coming together. It's like the perfect storm is here. And we are just this far away from stopping it. Is it last call for democracy? And if so, is that the last call for world peace? I mean, if we don't succeed in bringing democracy back to the United States and then start working aggressively with these countries, these other countries that have repudiated democracy, to return democracy to them. They have democratic traditions, and they have in their recent past, including, by the way, the majority of the European countries that, again, are moving away from democracy. They're all adopting Reaganism. I mean, even the European Union, you know, austerity and all this kind of stuff. If we don't return to democracy, in my opinion, World War III is inevitable. And it could be one that ends civilization. Now, from the point of view of the planet, that may be a good thing. You know, literally bomb us all back to the Stone Age. Put an end to the Industrial Revolution. But I think a much better way to do it would be to have a whole bunch of democratic countries working together to you know, tax carbon and move over to make the transition to renewable power. But I suspect that these are the choices that we're facing right now. John in Minneapolis. Hey, John, your thoughts?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, you know, unfortunately, so many people are brainwashed by Fox News and other, you know, conservative outlets over decades that they seem to think that markets and economy is democracy. And I'm sure this is what Mitch McConnell thinks, so that anything that even remotely affects the concentration of wealth at the top is going to destroy, you know, what their conception of democracy is. But the fact of the matter is, and they've been saying it, you know, kind of in so many different ways, and some people even directly, that they don't like democracy. Democracy just doesn't comport with how they see the world.
Yeah, Aaron Brook used to come on this program, you know, from the Objectivist Society, I think it was, you know, the Ayn Rand guy. And he used to just rail against democracy. You know, yeah, we don't believe in democracy. That's mob rule. That's not a good thing. You know, Stephen Moore was on this program about 10 years ago, and you know, this is before Trump tried to put him on the Fed. And I said, just right up, you know, I said, which is more important, democracy or capitalism? And he said, capitalism. He had this convoluted rationalization that democracy can't work without a capitalist system. I don't think that's true. And on the other hand, I think we can see that a communist government works just fine with capitalism. Look at China. But,
you know, there's this gross materialism that they don't seem to get, that human needs are far greater than what is provided by the marketplace. Yeah. Education, health care, fairness in laws, you know, and a framework which would protect people from the extreme of abuse of power, which we are chipping away at. And unfortunately, the other party jumped onto it. Everybody thought, wow, this is, you know, going to, you know, make us all rich. And instead, it's impoverished a lot of people. And yes, you can point to, well, you know, the standard of living has come up. But the fact of the matter is people do not have the freedom that they should have in a democracy. Yeah. And I think we should fight for democracy. I think it would be absolutely awful if this is the last stage of history, as somebody said.
Yeah, no, I think, frankly, we are at that threshold. We are at that edge right now. John, thank you for the call.
You're welcome.
Make your final point, you said? No, okay, he's gone. Jonathan in Warwick, Massachusetts. Hey, Jonathan, what's up?
Yes, hi. I just wanted to say that I agree with you. I think we're at our last gasp, but I think you have a much more liberal viewpoint of democracy. I'm hoping that democracy does happen in 2020, but since 1963, I feel like our lost USA republic came to be because every president since has betrayed their oath of office by not disclosing that level of coup d'etat or conspiracy that killed our president. But I think 2020, I'm with flybynews.com, and we're endorsing Bernie Sanders like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and others because Bernie's the only guy that has a foreign policy of any of the candidates that has took action against Saudi Arabia's attack on Yemen and is proposing clean energy.
Yeah, and Bernie's been talking about this stuff for years, spot on. And 3 members of the squad have endorsed him. And by the way, I got an email this morning from his campaign. In the last, whatever the period was, I don't know if it was a quarter or a month, but he got 400,000 more donations than Donald Trump did. That's a good sign. And, of course, Elizabeth Warren is also climbing in the polls. We'll be back. Your thoughts on this right after this.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
And 26,000 people in New York with AOC. Not bad. Not bad at all. We'll be back with your thoughts on, are we at the last stage here of this? And welcome back. Amir in West Hills, California, listening on KPFK. Hey, Amir, what's up?
Hello, yes. Tom, I wanted to re-echo basically your plea for contributions to Pacifica radio stations throughout the United States, particularly coming from the Kurdish community. You highlighted basically the main contradiction of our times, and that is basically tyranny versus democracy. And I have been in this country actually for most of my life, and I live in Southern California, and I wanted to say that KPFK has always been the voice of dissent and progressive forces. During a time that no one knew anything about basically the Kurds, KPFK provided a forum, a meaningful basically dialogue to discuss these issues. And
this is why independent media is so important, like KPFK.
Exactly, yeah. I totally, second, basically, there's nowhere else can you find this independent, basically, forum to provide, basically, information, awareness, raising public consciousness about issues that people do not know about. Walter once had said that there is nothing more annoying than to be vaguely hanged, and that was basically the history of the Kurds in the past, but now it's in the open. And I would say to your basically discussion about the role of democracy and how it is under threat throughout the world, going back to Western, Northeast Syria, Rojava, I think tyranny is really against any form of diversity and heterogeneity. And Rojava in Syria was the very expression and the epitome of this diversity, which is now brutally under attack. And it is happening. The ethnic cleansing is in the making. And I hope that, radio stations like KPFK continue to and financially are capable of promoting the just causes for secular democracy anywhere in the world, and Kurds have a stake, and therefore they should support Pacifica.
Yeah, well said, Amir. Thank you very much for the call. Susan in Phoenix, Arizona. Hey, Susan, what's up?
Hi, Tom. Yeah, I'd just like to make a point on the talk of democracy and restoring it. We can actually look at the campaigns right now, in my opinion, because when you don't have corporate donations in your campaign, that's a sure sign as you're letting people decide. And Bernie is our most successful at that.
Yep.
I mean,
and Elizabeth Warren is doing really well, too. They were within $500,000 of each other in terms of total donations. And they're both at the top of the pack, and neither one of them are taking corporate money or billionaire money. And, I think that's...
can help us.
I think what it does is it tells all of us that, that small d democracy, grassroots power, people... that American people still believe in the idea of democracy, and they still believe in the possibility that the American government can actually work for the average person instead of the billionaires. And I suspect that a lot of Americans have figured out how difficult that's going to be. If Bernie or Elizabeth Warren become president, they're going to have to take on the Supreme Court. They're going to have to take on the Koch brothers. They're going to have to take on the entire institutional Republican Party. They're going to have to take on big corporations like Amazon. It's going to be, and Facebook, it's going to be war, politically speaking. But if we don't have this, if we don't get through this, I think all is lost. Susan, thank you. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. The last gasps of freedom. By the way, in the second hour, I want to expand this. We're going to get into capitalism, the Republican Party, and religion. Some amazing stuff out of Pew about religion in the United States. And like I said, we're going to do that for the second hour. And our third hour today is going to be our science revolution piece. We're going to be talking about neurodiversity, neuropsychiatry, attention deficit disorder, all kinds of, it's going to be fascinating, so stick around. Kenyatta in Los Angeles. Hey, Kenyatta, what's up?
Well, I wanted for us to look into our crystal ball and look 13 months into the future. So it's the day after the election. It's Wednesday, November 4th, in the United States. One of three things has happened, Tom. Trump's either been reelected, and if he's reelected, there are going to be issues. Right now, we're already talking about Ukrainian interference, Russian interference. There's all kinds of stuff with voting machines. Or that's going to happen, or Trump has been defeated. If Trump's been defeated, that's going to be a problem as well, obviously, because like Voltaire said, those who can make you believe in absurdities can make you commit atrocities. And Trump's followers or sycophants, whatever they are, he's convinced them of absurdities.
Right.
Or lastly, one of the things that's going to happen is the election is contested. Somebody's meddled, and that's going to end up in the hands of the Supreme Court, which is a 6-3 court in actuality. And one of the liberal judges, supposedly liberal judges, sometimes wobbles. So, you could actually say it's a 7-2 court.
Are you talking about Breyer?
Yeah.
Stephen Breyer? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, he has been a little corporate friendly at times, yeah. And in fact, he wrote a book about it. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm just saying, and I wonder, one of those three things is going to happen.
Well, there are a few other possibilities, if the Democrats win, depending on who the Democratic standard bearer is, I think the outcome of the election could be very different. Number one, and number two, it's not impossible that the Democrat will be running against either Mitt Romney or Mike Pence.
Oh, I can't see anybody primarying Trump.
No, I'm talking about him getting impeached and removed from office in the next 6 months.
Oh,
see, the reason why the Democrats here's the thing.
Then you get Mike Pence.
Yeah, but exactly. Who may be easier or harder to defeat. I mean, he might be, the evangelical base, like I said, I'm going to get into this in the next hour, is just totally locked onto Trump, and largely because of Pence. 99% of white evangelicals say Donald Trump should not be impeached. I mean, and the reason why is because they think him and Pence are giving them everything that they want. So there are other possibilities. But I agree with you that in particular, if the election is contested, and if Trump loses, if Trump is the nominee and he loses, or if any Republican loses for that matter, there's going to be, there are going to be screams of outrage all over the country from these Republicans, and they're going to be saying, "Oh yeah, they got stolen," quack, 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 et cetera, et cetera. So,
they're throwing around they're throwing around the term civil war all over the right-wing media.
I know.
Right now.
Trump tweeted it, for goodness sake. Yeah, absolutely. Kenyatta, spot on. Thank you for the call. Tom in Minneapolis. Hey, Tom, what's up?
Hey, Tom, can you hear me?
Yeah.
No, I just wanted to elaborate a little bit on Paul from Minneapolis. He touched on this between democracy and capitalism and the tension.
Right.
But it's a little deeper than that. He touched it in passing. But what's going on is that the cons have intentionally confused where freedom comes from. They've convinced their followers that freedom comes from markets. If you look at Milton Friedman's book, Capitalism and Freedom, and Kevin Phillips' book on Wealth and Democracy, he goes into this. And libs know that freedom comes from democracy, but they've done this intentionally, and they don't like that economic capitalism is supposed to be subservient to political democracy. They want it up the other way around, upside down. Right?
Well, and they've accomplished that to a large extent, Tom, with the help of the Supreme Court.
Yes. So on your next book, when you write about democracy, you have to make reference to FDR's 36th speech on economic royalists. He gets into this when we talked about which one is subservient to which, right?
Yep.
And then Kevin Phillips' book on wealth and democracy, he talks about the tension between the two. And then also Milton Friedman's book, which started this whole thing about confusing freedom coming from market.
Right.
Yeah, and it's just, that's what's going on. The Republicans believe freedom is market.
Well,
and
and this, by the way, this is the sales pitch that is happening right now. Hang on, just say I've got the story here. Yeah, right here. Charles Koch, the headline, this is Alec Koch over at Truth Out. The headline is Charles Koch is funding a campaign to kill food stamps and Medicaid. This new group called the Foundation for Government Accountability, the FGA. Their sales pitch, they wined and dined Republicans at the White House and staffers at a Walt Disney Resort. And their pitch, make it harder for poor Americans to gain access to government programs, like food stamps and Medicaid. They have had victories to this effect in Kansas, Kentucky, Mississippi, and West Virginia. They're rolling out a nationwide version of this through the Trump administration this month to kick hundreds of thousands of people off food stamps. And it turns out it's heavily funded by Charles Koch and by the Bradley brothers and other right-wing nonprofits. And they are, quote, recasting cuts to public welfare benefits as encouraging the redeeming power of work.
Exactly. See, they use the word government as if it's some outside force oppressing you. And that would be true if we were not a democracy. But in a democracy, we are the government.
Right. And they are asserting that work is what gives life meaning, and work comes out of the marketplace, and government has no business in there. And the extent to which government provides a safety net, that discourages people from working. And that whole theory that if people have all their needs met, they'll never work. The lie to that is Charles Koch himself. I mean, he's had all he needs his whole entire life, and he shows up for work every day.
But the word government, we should always say our government, not just simply government, because that sounds like it's some outside evil force. No, it's our government.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said, Tom. Well said. Tom, thank you very much for the call. Thanks for listening to AM 950 in Minneapolis. We will be back. Well, I want to dig into this whole issue of, what's going on with Christianity. People are walking away in droves. Why is that? Does it have to do with the televangelists and the Christian oligarchs, the hustlers? Or is there something else happening? We'll be right back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
Our book today is The End of the Myth, From the Frontier to the Border Wall in the Mind of America by Greg Grandin. And this is from Chapter 1, titled All That Space. The British colonies in North America were conceived in expansion. America was an aspiration, an errand, and an obligation born out of violent Christian schism and Europe's interminable religious and imperial conflicts. Depending on the intricacies of their particular interpretations of Revelation, the Protestants who settled New England might have understood flight across the Atlantic as a way of escaping European war, or they might have seen migration as a chance to open a new front and win those wars on a new soil. Here in the 1600s, in the eschatological nebula of the New World, was the first paradoxical image of America as simultaneously pristine and despoiled, empty and at the same time filled with primitives begging for deliverance, subordinated to Catholic Spain, which had conquered its part of the Americas a century earlier, and stood as the great obstacle to Reformation England's rise as a world power. All yell and cry with one voice, Libertia, Libertia, Richard Hakluyt, a clergyman and court minister, wrote in the late 1500s, hoping to convince investors and his queen to establish an American colony. As Puritan society frayed under the harsh conditions of settler life, the frontier threatened and beckoned. The dark woods were filled with witches, and they were witchy, inviting hither. The forest was the place where the community could be redeemed and given new purpose, a chance to once again start anew, or it could be a place of more sorrows, wilderness sorrows, as two early Puritan patriarchs described the hardships that awaited those who ventured into uncharted territory, where whatever solidarity existed would be smashed into atoms as settlers scattered to escape the rule of the clergy. People are ready to run wild into the woods again and to be as heathenish as ever, warned Increase Mather. Expansions could be, often in the same sermon, held up as the cause of and the solution to the difficulties of establishing Christian communities. Either way, Native Americans had to get out of the way. They could die. They waste, they molder away, they disappear, said one Puritan chronicler of indigenous people who had succumbed to European pestilence years before the arrival of the Mayflower in 1620, thus clearing the earth for the establishment of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. God made way for his people by removing the heathen and planting them in the ground, said another observer. They could be murdered. The holy terror unleashed by the Puritans was, according to the historian Bernard Bailyn, driven by fears of what could happen to civilized people in an unimaginable wilderness and fears of racial conflicts in which God's children were fated to struggle with pitiless agents of Satan, pagan antichrists swarming in the world around them. Survivors could be enslaved. The first patent granted in colonial America in 1626 was to a Virginia merchant and planter, William Claiborne, for inventing a device that would not just restrain Indians, but also make them work. Claiborne was given an Indian to experiment on for the trial of his invention. Colonial records do not say what this innovation might have been, only noting that it was not successful. Or they could be pushed further and further west. The prodigious and relentless population, complained New Orleans Spanish governor in 1794, progressively drives the Indian nations before them and upon us, seeking to possess for itself this vast continent which the Indians occupy between the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, the Gulf of Mexico, and the Appalachian Mountains. More than a century and a half later, writing in the early 1950s, the Mexican author and diplomat Octavio Paz made much the same point. America was, he writes, if anything, geography, pure space, open to human action. Since it lacked historical substance, ancient social classes, established institutions, religions, and hereditary laws, reality presented no obstacles other than natural ones. Men struggled not against history, but against nature. And wherever there was an historical obstacle, indigenous societies say, it was simply erased from history, reduced to a mere natural fact and dispensed with accordingly. Evil is outside, part of the natural world, like Indians, rivers, mountains, and other obstacles that must be domesticated or destroyed. End of quote. The American Revolution is a permanent revolution, Paz went on, a nonstop expulsion of, quote, all elements foreign to the American essence and a constant invention of itself. And anything that stands in the way of that invention, anything that is in any way irreducible or inassimilable to perpetual creation, be it Native American, Spanish America, or history itself, quote, is not American. Quote, in other places, the future is one of man's attributes because we are men. We have a future. In Saxon America, the process is inverted and the future determines the man. We are men because we are the future, and everything that has no future is not a man. End of quote. The United States, Paz said, offers no room for contradictions, ambiguity, or conflict. The nation flies forward swiftly, as if weightless across the land. Trying to stop North Americans moving west, Stephen Austin, the founder of Texas, said over a century earlier, was like trying to stop the Mississippi with a dam of straw. The drive west waxed and waned and burst forward with great passion during key moments. The book, The Edge of the Myth, by Greg Grandin. Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Cheated on his
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Is it the end of the world as we know it? I don't know. I want to talk, in the previous hour, just to recap, if you're just tuning in, I was laying out this thing called democratic peace theory, which Immanuel Kant came up with in 1795. It was endorsed by Adam Smith, the author of Wealth of Nations, was endorsed by Thomas Paine, was embraced by the early French Revolution. The idea that if every country in the world became a democracy, there would be no more war. It would end war for all time. Woodrow Wilson embraced this theory. It's why he called World War I the war to end all wars, and argued for the League of Nations. And the theory is that democracies will never go to war because as long, and you're defining a democracy as a free press, multiple political parties, including opposition parties, and most importantly, that the will of the people actually gets accomplished. Now, by that definition, you could say America is no longer a democracy. Because since, by and large, the Reagan Revolution, particularly with Republican administrations, what we get are laws that are not supported by the vast majority of the people and policies that are not supported by the vast majority of the people. So you could argue, at least during Republican administrations, that we are not democratic, small d democratic, and even during democratic, the majority of the people did not want NAFTA, but Bill Clinton got it to us. The majority of the people didn't want the ownership rules of television and radio to be changed, but, we got the Telecommunications Act in '96. The majority of the people didn't want, the bankruptcy laws to be changed so that student loans couldn't be discharged in bankruptcy. Well, actually, that was during the George W. Bush administration. But my point is that when the majority of the people can decide what the country does, people will never vote to send their own children off to a war that's not defensive. That's not the response. That is not a response to an attack. You get a Pearl Harbor, you get a 9/11. Yeah, there's going to be a response, and it may be a war. And I think with Pearl Harbor, that's pretty hard to dispute. With 9/11, it's a whole different thing because it wasn't a state that attacked us, unless it was Saudi Arabia by proxy. It was a religious group that grew out of Saudi Wahhabism. But in any case, I think that's a debatable tangent. The point is that when you have healthy democracies, you don't have war. And what Trump is doing is embracing countries that are not democracies or are only, titular democracies, like Russia or China, which actually calls themselves communist, and doesn't have opposition parties, doesn't have a free press, and doesn't have, popular elections. So it's clearly not a democracy. But Trump is embracing, and Saudi Arabia, a brutal dictatorship. Trump is embracing these countries. And he's embracing leaders of what were democratic countries, but the leaders have renounced democracy. Modi in India, Duterte in the Philippines, Erdogan in Turkey, El-Sisi in Egypt. The list goes on. And that by doing this, he is damaging democracy all around the world and thus radically increasing the probability of war. And my point was that the 2020 election coming up in November of this year, or next year rather, if this, a year from now, 13 months from now, if this neoconservative, neoliberal ideology that has been embraced by the Republican Party since 1980, was embraced by the Supreme Court in 1976, and inflicted on America. And we saw another example of that today where the Supreme Court said, the Republicans gerrymandered Michigan, that's just fine. And the reason for this, of course, the reason that the Republicans got away with it is because before that, the Supreme Court said, billionaires want to own politicians, that's just fine. That was 76. That got us Reagan. So what we're watching is the destruction of democracy all around the world, and at the same time, along with it, we're seeing the risk of war going up. And I have a real concern that World War III is not going to be pretty. Every time we have a major war, the weapons that were just introduced in the previous war are used. Whether it's aircraft or whether it's new kinds of bombing or whether it's, a napalm, whatever it may be, now it's nukes. And a World War III, I'm quite sure, would be a nuclear war, and it could be a civilization killer. Literally, the end of human civilization. Which, as I said last hour, there are people who would argue that's a good thing for the planet. I'm not so sure. But there is a group who actually thinks it would be a wonderful thing to have a civilization-ending war, a planet-ending war. And that group calls themselves evangelicals, or evangelical Christians. This last-day doom cult that has consumed Christianity and melded itself at the hip to the Republican Party. This is, how else can you say it other than to say, clearly not a healthy thing. Now, interestingly, the Pew Research Center just came out with this report, day before yesterday, actually. And it's over at their website, pewforum.org. And the headline, in the United States, the decline of Christianity continues at a rapid pace. They note that 43% of American adults identify with Protestantism, or call themselves Protestant Christians, down from 51% in 2009. All subsets of religiously unaffiliated people have seen their numbers increase. 17% of Americans now describe their religion as, quote, nothing in particular, up from 12% in 2009. And this is if you aggregate all of it among Christians. In 2009, 78% of Americans identified themselves as Christians. Today, it's 65%. As religiously affiliated Christians. And the percentage of people who identify themselves as religiously unaffiliated Christians from 2009 to today has gone from 16% up to 26%. And both Protestants and Catholics are shrinking as a percentage of our population. Now, that's just looking at Christianity. But it raises a really interesting question. Why? Excuse me. I've said on this program, I've been saying this for 16 years, that I consider myself a Christian in that, I was raised in Christianity. And so, it's kind of baked into me. And I love the words of Jesus. I think, he was a great philosopher. This whole idea of, original sin and the need for salvation and Jesus died for your sin. I have a problem with all that. But I don't think that makes me not a Christian. But I can tell you that there's a lot of Christian churches that would say, no, you're not welcome here. Not with that perspective. So I'm one of those unaffiliated Christians who believes in the teachings and the ethos of the religion, but not in all of the doctrine. and not in some of the more far out stuff like, oh, we've got to have this war to end all wars, where the Second Temple gets erected, where the Al-Aqsa Mosque gets taken over by Christians or Jews, and then Jesus will, then there's a giant war in Israel, and only 144,000 Jews are left, and they all convert to Christianity to avoid being destroyed, and then Jesus returns to the earth. So why is Christianity in decline in the United States? I mean, I think this is a really important and meaningful question. I think that a lot of it has to do with the fact that big money has corrupted Christianity the same way it's corrupted the Republican Party. And to some extent, to a large extent, the Democratic Party as well. You've got evangelical mega church pastors and televangelists who are they've become the new Borgias, the Italian family that had 3 popes. Kind of took over the Catholic Church for a while and lived in bizarre excess. And this is the evangelical megachurch pastors and the televangelists. They're living lives of luxury. They're building massive personal fortunes. They've got private jets. They've got estates. And they're telling their followers that God loves this particular corrupt politician and that particular corrupt politician. I'd say the Catholic Church never excised their own internal rot and corruption, which goes back to the Borgias. And they're paying a price for it right now. And Protestant Christianity is at a crossroads. Is Protestant Christianity going to return to their core, their generally apolitical middle-class values? The Methodist church that I was raised in, where politics was literally never mentioned. Or will the most visible leaders among the Protestant religions continue to embrace the Republican Party and its billionaire mega donors and thus continue to destroy Christianity? And then you look at the numbers. 94% of Republicans overall oppose impeaching Donald Trump and removing him from office. Okay? 94%. But among evangelicals, 99% oppose impeaching Donald Trump. The guy who grabs women, the guy who assaults women, the guy who has had 2 divorces and is on his 3rd wife, who got into the United States now, on an Einstein visa, and who brought her parents over with chain migration and all the. It's like, that Trump is campaigning against. I mean, Stephen Miller's head has to be exploding, right? But has capitalism and the Republican Party destroyed religion? I guess that's ultimately the question. Can religion, just like in the first hour I was asking, basically, can peace recover from capitalism and the Republican Party? Can democracy recover from the Supreme Court inflicting all this damage on it over the years and the Republican Party? And now can religion recover from this? I'm doubtful. We'll be back.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
It would be fascinating to know what's happening with some of the more progressive of the Protestant denominations. And welcome back. Amazing stuff, isn't it? Just amazing. Johnny in Galveston, Texas. Hey, Johnny, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom. First of all, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
All right. The oligarchic class, or the corporate industrial class, or the deep-pocketed donor class, who love to throw lots of money behind pre-screened Americans who are ideologically weak and more in line with their big biz values, who they push mostly in the Republican Party and to a lesser degree in the Democratic Party. These guys have a Calvinistic, social, Darwinistic worldview, such that this idea about the democratic peace theory, in their world, that doesn't exist. When they think that it's time to do a periodic culling of the world population, that's what they push for, regardless of what you and I like to subscribe to. And the only way we can overcome that, I'm afraid, if we can you still hear me?
Yes, I'm listening.
Okay, well, I'll just hang up after I just make this last point. Is the only way for us to overcome that is if massive amounts of our country and other Western countries show up and tell the people on the right wing, enough is enough.
Right.
That's the only hope
This
we
is
have.
this is
And
this
I'll
is
hang
my
up
concern,
and,
Johnny, is that this election is literally our last chance. It is literally our last chance. Johnny, thank you. Spot on. Gary in Baden, Pennsylvania. Hey, Gary, what's up?
Good morning, Tom. Thank you.
Hey, Gary. Greed has no heart.
Greed has no heart ever. And that's what actually you're talking about.
You're right.
Yeah, it keeps coming back to that.
Everything is meta to that, it seems.
It always comes back to that, doesn't it, Thom Hartmann?
Yep.
So the only thing I would like to add, and I would like to quote Franklin Delano Roosevelt's inaugural address in 1936. By the way, the previous FDR, you were right, it was the nomination speech in 1936, the previous quote. But having said all that, maybe your show should be called today, I would call it hopeful but tempered by reality. Mm-hmm. The reality of will voting be enough in 2020? Right. So the jury's out. I'm hopeful. I am hopeful. But like you, and I guess I've said it for a number of years, I was doubtful, to be frank with you, not to say anything more, but I was doubtful, but hopeful. So this is where we're at in America 2019. We're at the breaking point. We all know it. We all don't admit it, but we all, I think, know it. And in closing, I'd like to close on that Franklin Delano Roosevelt quote that he gave in the inauguration speech of 1936 when he said that the test of progress is not whether we add more to the abundance of those who have much, but whether we provide, whether or not we provide too little for those who have, more to those who have less that have too little.
I get where you're going with it, Gary, and I remember the quote. I can't quote it verbatim either, but yes, absolutely, and better a government, that has excesses of generosity. Essentially, I forget how he phrased that. Than is frozen in the ice of its own indifference as well. The other piece of that. Gary, thank you. Great to hear from you. We'll be right back. It's 22 minutes past the hour. Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere. He needs to be Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. So, where is this all heading? It looks to me like what we're seeing is, around the world, is the death of democracy. And parallel with that, you could say it looks like we're seeing the death of that part of religion that is compassionate, that is understanding, that is nurturing, that is deeply spiritual. And those kinds of religions and those dimensions of religion are being replaced by, you see this in the Middle East with the rise of ISIS and fundamentalist Islam that has metastasized out of the cancer in Saudi Arabia of Wahhabism. You're seeing this in the United States in the cancer of televangelists and mega church pastors metastasizing out of a business model, basically, that was provided by television and radio back 30, 40 years ago of brokered time and has become basically a major big business. I mean, I remember in 1980, I went to the National Religious Broadcasters Association, NRBA, in Washington, D.C., to their annual convention. I talked about this a couple weeks ago on the air about Robert Schiller giving the keynote address and just horrifying people because he called them out. He said, "You are sheep, you are ravening wolves among the sheep." I mean, it was just like, you know, he just horrified people. But it, you know, it was a trade show. There were booths. They were selling. You know, it's a multi-billion-dollar a year industry. And it has its lords and ladies, and it's no longer Jim and Tammy Faye Baker, but now it's Jerry Falwell Jr. and Franklin Graham and you know, a whole bunch of megachurch megachurch pastors who are, you know, whose names are not common among people who just, you know, who are not fundamentalists, but the kind of Christianity that they're embracing is the kick the poor to the curb Christianity. It's the so-called prosperity gospel. It's neo-Calvinism. It's a reinvention. You know, John Calvin was like, well, you know, we're all sinners because we were all born by women, and women, that's the original sinner, right? Was Eve, and therefore, since we're all sinners, how do we figure out who's going to run the show? Well, God has already told us who He wants to run the show. They're the people He made rich, so they should be running the show. And thus we end up with Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump tweeting out a picture of their son for Halloween dressed as a stormtrooper, saying the force is strong in my family. No, the stormtroopers were the bad guys, Ivanka, please. This is pseudo-religion.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
And I think it speaks to the issue, actually. We'll be back and take your calls after the break. It's 28 minutes past the hour. Our book today is Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism and Other Arguments for Economic Independence by Kristen Godsey. And this is from the introduction titled, You Might Be Suffering from Capitalism. The argument of this book can be summed up succinctly. Unregulated capitalism is bad for women. And if we adopt some ideas from socialism, women will have better lives. If done properly, socialism leads to economic independence, better labor conditions, better work-family balance, and yes, even better sex. Finding a way into a better future requires learning from the mistakes of the past, including a thoughtful assessment of the history of 20th century state socialism in Eastern Europe. That's it. If you like the idea of such outcomes, then come along for an exploration of how we might change things. If you're dubious because you don't understand why capitalism as an economic system is uniquely bad for women, and if you doubt that there could ever be anything good about socialism, this short treatise will provide some illumination. If you don't give a whit about women's lives because you're a gynophobic right-wing internet troll, save your money and go back to your parents' basement right now. This isn't the book for you. Of course, some might argue that unregulated capitalism sucks for almost everyone, but I want to focus on how capitalism disproportionately harms women. Competitive labor markets discriminate against those whose reproductive biology makes them primarily responsible for childbearing. Today, this means humans who get pink hats in the hospital and the letter F next to the name on their birth certificate, as if we've already failed by not coming into the world as a boy. Competitive labor markets also devalue those expected to be the primary caregivers of children. Although societal attitudes have evolved in this regard, our idealization of motherhood means that most of us still believe that baby needs mama, a whole lot more than papa, at least until the child is old enough to play sports. Others will argue that unregulated capitalism is not bad for all women. Yes, for those women lucky enough to sit at the top of the income distribution, the system works pretty well. Although women at the executive level still face gender pay gaps and remain underrepresented in leadership positions, on the whole, things aren't too shabby for the Sheryl Sandbergs of the world. Of course, sexual harassment still hinders progress, even for those at the top, and too many women believe that if you want to run with the big dogs, you may have to suck it up and ignore the groping and unwanted advances. And race plays an important role as well. White women do a lot better in aggregate than do women of color. But when we look at society as a whole, on average, women are comparatively worse off in countries where markets are less encumbered by regulation, taxation, and public enterprises than they are in nations where state revenues support greater levels of redistribution and larger social safety nets. Choose your data source, and you find the same story. Unemployment and poverty plague women with children. Employers discriminate against women without children because they might have them in the future. In the United States in 2013, women over the age of 65 suffered from poverty at much greater rates than men and dominated those in the category of extreme poverty. Globally, women face higher rates of economic deprivation. Women are often the last to be hired and the first to be fired in cyclical downturns. And when they do find employment, bosses pay them less than men. When states need to slash government spending on education, health care, or old age pensions, mothers, daughters, sisters, and wives must pick up the slack, diverting their energy to care for the young, the sick, and the elderly. Capitalism thrives on women's unpaid labor in the home because women's care work supports lower taxes. Lower taxes mean higher profits for those already at the top of the income ladder, mostly men. But capitalism was not always so savage. Throughout much of the 20th century, state socialism presented an existential challenge to the worst excesses of the free market. The threat posed by Marxist ideologies forced Western governments to expand social safety nets to protect workers from the unpredictable but inevitable booms and busts of the capitalist economy. After the Berlin Wall fell, many celebrated the triumph of the West, consigning socialist ideas to the dustbin of history. But for all its faults, state socialism provided an important foil for capitalism. It was in response to a global discourse of social and economic rights, a discourse that appealed not only to the progressive populations of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, but also to many men and women in Europe and Western Europe and North America, that politicians agreed to improve working conditions for wage laborers, as well as to create social programs for children, the poor, the elderly, the sick, and the disabled, mitigating exploitation and the growth of income inequality. Although there were important antecedents in the 1980s, once state socialism collapsed, capitalism shook off the constraints of market regulation and income redistribution. Without the looming threat of a rival superpower, the last 30 years of global neoliberalism have witnessed a rapid shriveling of social programs that protect citizens from cyclical instability and financial crises and reduce the vast inequality of economic outcomes between those at the top and those at the bottom of the income distribution. For much of the 20th century, Western capitalist countries also endeavored to outdo the East European countries in terms of women's rights, fueling progressive social change. For example, the state socialists in the USSR and Eastern Europe were so successful at giving women economic opportunities outside the home that initially, for the 2 decades after the end of World War II, women's wage work was conflated with the evils of communism. The American way of life meant male breadwinners and female homemakers. But slowly, socialist championing of women's emancipation began to chip away at the Leave It to Beaver ideal. The Soviet launch of Sputnik in 1957 spurred American leaders to rethink the costs of maintaining traditional gender roles. They feared the state socialists enjoyed an advantage in technological development and why women have better sex under socialism. Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. So, what is going on with all of this stuff? AB in Lake Forest, Illinois. Hey, AB, what's up?
Two major things in regards to religion. I think essentially Facebook is kind of taking that down, and the past surveys, I think people felt embarrassed if they didn't have a religion. So they...
Wait a minute. And just say, you said Facebook is taking that down. What does that mean?
Well, there's so much more interesting stuff to do for young people than go to church.
Oh, I see. Okay. You don't think that was always the case?
Not really. Not until everybody got very self-involved with their small groups and, this other stuff, except the Kardashians and so forth.
Okay.
In regards to war, we will always have war as long as we have population growth and expansion and wants and expectations in a finite world.
I agree. And you know how the Iroquois ended war?
How?
They two steps. Number one, their population was stable. Jefferson wrote about this. He was amazed. It was considered a shameful thing for a woman to have a child more than once every 7 years, and in Iroquois society. And the reason why was because women had power in their culture, and in fact, women were the only ones who were allowed to vote in 4 out of the 5 Iroquois nations. So the consequence of that was that population stabilized. Whenever women have power equal to, or in some cases even greater than men, population stabilizes. And once population stabilized, then the question was, how do we resolve disputes between the nations? I mean, serious disputes like territory disputes and things. And they invented the game lacrosse for that. And there's a painting hanging in the National Museum in one of the Smithsonian galleries of about 20,000 Native American Iroquois dressed up in full war regalia playing lacrosse. It was a 4-day lacrosse match that, and this was witnessed by the American painter, in the late 1700s or early 1700s. And in order to resolve a dispute between two nations. And they literally did not have genocidal wars. In fact, outside of when the Dene people were pushed because of climate, during the Little Ice Age, a whole bunch of people basically fled north central Canada, and what we now call Canada. These were native. This was before we came along, before Europeans came along. They fled this area up there because it became uninhabitable because it was so cold for about 3 years in a row, and came down into central United States. And we call those people now the Cherokees the Sioux and the Comanches, I believe it was, and they invaded the space that was then occupied by the Hopi and the people who are the Pueblo people that are associated with the Hopi, and that produced an actual war, where there was actual people killing each other. But outside of that, the history of actual genocidal wars, where one people tried to kill another people, or even exterminate another people. Now, it's pretty much a European invention. And I think that has to do with the fact that in most of these Aboriginal and Indigenous societies, women had power. And, of course, in Europe...
I would agree.
Yeah.
I agree with that. I think women would have a moderating effect on everything in the planet.
Right.
And the more they can get back into power... Well, just like Christians, Christians used to worship Mary, and then it switched over to
It switched in the 1500s. And there's a book called The Alphabet versus the Goddess by Leonard Schlein. And Leonard Schlein has passed away now. He was a brain surgeon. I knew Leonard Schlein. And in fact, we had some just fascinating conversations. And in his book, The Alphabet versus the Goddess, which is probably still in print, it's certainly, I'm sure you can easily find copies, he lays out this hypothesis that when we started teaching people abstract alphabets, in other words, we started teaching people how to read before the age of 7, which is a major developmental milestone, what happened was it led to an exaggeration of the left hemisphere of the brain, which is where we process linear, non-emotional, abstract stuff like alphabets, and diminishing the right hemisphere of the brain, which controls the left side of the body, which is where we process emotions. And this is hyper simplified, right? But in any case,
the opposite. You mean the left lobe is the right side, and the right lobe is the
that's what I'm saying.
Left side.
That's correct.
Oh, good.
Yeah. But that's kind of tangential to this. But the point is that when young people started learning alphabet at an early age, that flipped society from being egalitarian and even matriarchal to being hierarchical and patriarchal. And he goes back to the 1500s, and he says this all started with Gutenberg. Prior to Gutenberg, for 1,000 years prior to the invention of the printing press, the only people who were legally allowed to learn how to read were priests. And everybody else was forbidden to know how to read. And the vast majority of all the churches in Europe were dedicated to Mary, and there were Mary shrine, and there were Mary cults, and Mary was everywhere, and Jesus was pretty much an afterthought in Christianity in Europe, right up until the 1500s. And then Gutenberg came along with the printing press, and it kind of broke up the monopoly that the Catholic Church had on literacy, and combined with the Renaissance, just in the previous century. And this led to widespread literacy. And within 2 generations of widespread literacy, you had the burning of witches. In other words, men just took revenge on women. You had the burning of witches. You had the entire medical profession, which had been women, taken over by men, including childbirth. But it used to be the women who were the herbalists. And this is where the whole witch thing came from. And, as a negative thing, it was when the men took over. And he's like, it's a powerful and compelling hypothesis. Anyhow, AB, I gotta move along, but thank you for the call. It's good to hear from you. Steve in Blacksburg, Virginia. Hey, Steve, what's up?
Oh, yes, Tom, thank you very much for taking my call.
Sure.
I mean, I agree with you so much, almost 100% of the time. But I wanted to explain that, I was raised in a very conservative Baptist home.
Mm-hmm.
And I do not understand all of these people nowadays that claim to be Christians that are following Donald Trump just lockstep.
And the Republican Party. And this whole idea that Charles Koch is out there pitching right now, that, we need to do away with food stamps and basically all subsidies. We need to do away with Medicaid, because if poor people are in distress, they'll be more inclined to work, and work is the thing that saves us all. It's like, wait a minute, I thought Jesus.
What happened to taking care of the poor?
Exactly. This is a rejection of Christian values. It's a rejection of religious values. And frankly, I think it's a rejection of human values, Steve.
It's 3 and 4.
Yeah. Amen. I'm with you. Thank you very much. Martin in Atlanta, Georgia. Hey, Martin, what's on your mind?
Hey, Tom, how you doing today? I am a retired pastor. I've been out of the church almost 20 years now as far as an organized religion.
Mm-hmm. Do you mind my asking what church?
It was an independent apostolic Pentecostal church, so we're talking really over to the right. But even as right as we were, everybody was welcome. There was no class distinction. There was no race distinction. We actually fed the poor. Those are ideals. But even that organization itself started to crumble in the 80s, about the time Falwell started, and corporations figured out that we could influence voters based on religion.
Yeah, in the late 60s, for about 6 months, I don't think I became a member, but I was regularly attending the North Lansing Church of God. I mean, which is one of the most fundamentalist Christian, evangelical denominations or Pentecostal denominations. And that was my sense too, was that, and they were doing a lot of outreach to the poor and those kind of things. And that entire denomination now has been taken over by basically people who are, praising mammon, in my opinion. Back to you, Martin.
Well, the thing that we used to do, I mean, we taught against succumbing to the temptations of worldly things, like having to have a new car, having to have the newest phone, having to have material possessions over the needs of our fellow human beings.
Yep.
And that's why this particular religion, which was growing in the 70s, we saw a lot of growth. We called it latter rain. We had a lot of growth, and the evangelical movement at that time was a movement towards humanity. And corporate America could not have that, because all of a sudden we didn't value the new shiny things that were being waved in our face, and we valued the fact that our neighbors were safe, that our neighbors were healthy, that we took care of one another, we loved each other as God loves us.
Right.
And that was sold by the wayside. And over the past few years, it's been so co-opted now, but we've seen this before. Tyrants and rulers have used the churches to support their craziness, wars, and all of their greed and their excessive, lavish lifestyles, which is why we saw the Soviet Union totally revolt against religion during the Russian Revolution, and then we see that Orthodox Church taking over, and of course it is the pet of the oligarchs like Putin, and we see what it's doing to Russia and what it's doing around the world, and the American evangelical church is no different.
Yeah.
It is now a corporate church that only cares about money and power, and God's teachings be damned. The Bible talked about the spirit of Antichrist taking over the land. This evangelical movement is the spirit of Antichrist, because anybody that follows it or believes in it is following anti-Christian values.
Amen. I completely agree with you. And then we get this weird stuff. You've got, Charles Koch and his buddies putting together this foundation for government accountability. And their sales pitch is that we need to destroy the social safety net. We need to end specifically food stamps and Medicaid. And the reason why is because work is redeeming. They're talking about, and I quote, the redeeming power of work. In other words, work gives our lives meaning, work gives us income, and I think most people kind of appreciate the power of work, but redeeming. But anyhow, they're saying that this is the thing. If people aren't made incredibly uncomfortable, they won't work. And
that's why we have the class warfare.
I know, but it's like, isn't Charles Koch the poster boy for the opposite of that? I mean, he's been comfortable his entire life, and yet he works his butt off. I don't think that work and discomfort have any relationship to each other, frankly.
Well, the thing is, Tom, that people are being sold. The reason you are not wealthy is because the poor people are a drain on society, not because the oligarchs are controlling 40% of the wealth. It's because somebody who breaks a leg and loses their job gets hungry, and we may have to feed them. And as Christians, we are to feed them.
Yeah, there you go. Well said, Martin. Thank you very much for the call. And thanks for watching Free Speech TV down there in Atlanta, Georgia. Good to hear from you. And always great to hear from a retired pastor. We'll be back. It's 47 minutes past the hour here on the Thom Hartmann Program. Is religion doomed? Is peace doomed? Or is it possible for a renewal of both, of democracy in America and of Christianity?
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archive.
And I realize there's similar debates going on, in Islam and in Judaism and in other religions as well. We'll be right back. And welcome back. Morris in California. Hey, Morris, what's up?
Hey, Professor, check this out. Elohenu melech achalom, baruch atah Adonai. That's a prayer. I'm studying Hebrew right now, and I've been told by my Hebrew teacher that I speak more Hebrew than most Jewish people. But I want to share this with you. You were talking about democracy. I wasn't going to fool with you today, but when you was talking about democracy, you got my ear. There's a lady named Nancy McLean. She wrote a book called Democracy in Chains, The Radical Rights Stealth Plan for America. Now, what she says, and her theme is, we are the longest-standing democracy, the Bill of Rights, etc., but we are the least responsive, voter suppression, election fraud. And I would take issue with this. The greatest threat that humanity has right now isn't so much from the right-wingers with their false narrative, linguistic facades, and euphemistic phrases, but I think it's found in the Democratic Party, which are corporate Democrats. Remember a few years ago when Mr. Obama was the president and the Swiss bank paid nearly $3 billion fine because 40,000 Americans were hiding their money in that account over there because they didn't want to pay taxes? Do you remember that, Professor?
Yeah.
Okay. I believe in my heart and soul that a lot of those folks were, in government, right? On people that.
Oh, I believe so too. Morris, have you seen The Laundromat?
No, sir, I haven't.
There is a movie that played, it stars Meryl Streep. It's got an all-star cast. It's amazing. Antonio Banderas, a whole bunch of people. And it played one day in theaters. And then the two lawyers who are portrayed in the movie sued and got it out of distribution. And they just lost, finally, after a year and a half or thereabouts, finally lost their lawsuit. And it's available now on Netflix. It's called The Laundromat, and it's the story of it's the story of the Panama Papers, how all these insanely rich people who are hiding their money through this one Fonseca something or other, this one law firm that these two lawyers ran. I mean, they were literally making thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of shell companies to hide money and basically screw people. And, you know, it starts out with this woman whose husband drowned in a boat, and it turned out that the insurance company wasn't going to pay because it was a shell company in Panama, and it was just a scam to steal money from people, blah de blah. And but it's the same thing as what happened with the Swiss bank. It's really a great movie. It's called The Laundromat, and it's on Netflix. Louise and I watched it just a couple days ago because it just became available last week. Anyhow, back to you, Morris.
Well, I'm going to check it out, and I want everybody to know, don't be depressed. Next year is not an election year. It's a movement year. We got a movement going on, y'all. Remember down in Hawaii when Monsanto spent $80 million and the Hawaiians only spent $1 million and the Hawaiians beat them? That's how we're going to beat the money this year. Everybody's going to get out and vote. There's a movement. We got to think our coattails. If you put a corporate Democrat up there, we got some trouble. If you put a progressive up there, we got this. All the way down to the school board. Get out and vote. Thank you.
From your lips to God's ears, Morris. You're spot on. And this is going to be the deciding election. I am convinced. I have known that the stakes were really high for many of the elections while I've been doing this program and throughout my life. I thought the stakes were really high when Reagan was elected. I thought, if Ronald Reagan comes into power, we're probably going to have World War III. It's probably going to be a nuclear war. Reagan was such a warmonger. He apparently got restrained, but he set all this stuff in motion that led us right to Donald Trump. And we're either going to repudiate Reaganism and neoliberalism and elect a progressive president and a House and Senate, or we're not. And if not, I'm not real optimistic. Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
All the people who are. Well, welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you, and Chris in Port Washington, New York. Hey, Chris, what's up?
Hey, Tom, how you doing? I just wanted to comment on what you're talking about, the role of women. I had a background in the financial markets and a financial journalist for a while. I did some articles and some research that in many developing countries, economic development money goes towards small business ventures by women in those countries, by homespun industries, like to really kind of kickstart economic development.
Yeah, this is what Grameen Bank was all about. That one, what was Mohammed's last name? I'm forgetting his last name. He won the Nobel Prize for this.
That's right. I remember having cited him too. There's a bank I had written about that was out of Chicago-based bank, and there were bigger bank, but part of what they did was economic development. And this was in, again, small homespun industries, and the results of which really helped to kickstart the economies. And,
Yes.
It should not be underestimated, of course, although it will be kind of just cast aside as being like, more like charity than it is really an investment, but it really is.
Yeah. Yeah. Good point, Chris. Excellent point. Thank you very much for calling and making it. Xavier in Bowling Green, Ohio. Hey, Xavier, what's up?
Hey, Tom. Good to talk with you again. Actually, I'd been on hold for a little bit, and it got really interesting when you brought up the aspect of religion, and it kind of hit home personally because growing up, I was raised in a Roman Catholic church and went to a private school, parochial school during that time. And as I was growing up, I was interested in becoming a deacon. I started going down the path of, religious leadership. And as I did, and there's a point that I'm going to bring up right after this, but I think it's relevant to say this, that as I started to read the Bible, it took me a good year, a little over a year to read it, in the third grade to the fourth grade. And it obviously took me a lot of time, to look up words, understand the sentences and whatnot. And eventually I started to question everything. Mm-hmm. And because of this, it leads me to wonder if there is some level of correlation. Eventually I lost my faith. And the reason why I did was because I got information. Now, I completely support my Christian friends, my Muslim friends, my Hindu friends. It doesn't matter what they believe. I 100% support them, and I'm like, if you still have your faith, good for you, and I'll discuss it with them. However, I wonder if there's a correlation between the wealth of information we have now, because the more information I got, the less I believed. But now with the Internet and people are able to obtain information, if there's a correlation that there's the loss of Christianity in lieu of the information made available, because
I think there's a shift. Xavier, let me lay this out as a hypothesis, sure. and you can test this for me. First of all, why do we have religion? I think that we have religion for two purposes. Number one, that most people have had the experience at some point in their life of transcendence. And religion is an effort to explain that. And then secondly, it's an effort to explain why things happen. Why did lightning hit George? It must be that God was upset with George. So as we've developed science, we've figured out that an awful lot of these explanations for why things happen just didn't make sense. And an awful lot of what's in the Bible is like, that's a Bronze Age religion. It's like, it's not to the modern time. But I think that the spirituality part, the transcendence part, has stuck around. And that's why people are saying, yes, I'm a Christian, but I'm unaffiliated. Because I like the transcendence.
Absolutely.
I like the getting high part of it. But the whole doctrine thing, that was fine in 1600 maybe. Xavier, I'm sorry, we're out of time. No worries. One of these days we'll have a longer conversation, but we just hit the end of the hour. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
We say fight back!
Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere. Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Cokeland, The Secret History of Coke Industries and Corporate Power in America by Christopher Leonard. This is from the preface. On May 18th, 1981, 4 Wall Street bankers traveled to Wichita, Kansas. They went there to make an offer to Charles Koch, the CEO of an obscure mid-size energy company. The bankers from Morgan Stanley wanted to convince Koch to take his family's company public, offering shares for sale on the New York Stock Exchange. Their deal was squarely in line with the conventional wisdom of corporate America at the time. Going public was seen as a natural progression for companies like Koch Industries, offering them access to big pools of money and promising enormous paydays for the existing team of executives. All it required from the CEO was to surrender control. Morgan Stanley, in return, would collect a small fortune in fees. Charles Koch was 45 years old. He had run Koch Industries since he was 32 when his father died suddenly. He was trim, tall, and had an athlete's build. He spoke quietly in meetings and seemed almost passive. The bankers laid out their plan to take Koch public. They revealed what, to most executives at least, might have been the most significant detail. If Charles Koch agreed to the deal, he could earn $20 million overnight. The bankers seemed incredulous when they prepared a confidential memo about Koch's reaction. He does not want this cash, the memo reported. Charles Koch calmly explained to them why their offer made no sense. His company was breathtakingly profitable. It operated in vital, deeply complex corners of the American energy industry. During the 1980s, Koch Industries was the largest purchaser and transporter of U.S. crude oil. It owned an oil refinery. It employed teams of commodity traders who bought and sold a wildly diverse menu of raw materials and financial products, from gasoline to paper futures contracts. This might have encouraged most CEOs to take their company public. Koch Industries, however, did not want outsiders to know how much money its traders were earning. Taking the company public would expose too many of its secrets. The memo said, certain of Koch's commodity traders are particularly worried that their high salaries, once disclosed to the public, would be used against them by their trading partners. Secrecy was a strategic necessity for Koch Industries. Charles Koch did not want to surrender it. He also didn't want to surrender control. He had a specific, clear vision of how to run his company, and he didn't need Wall Street investors to interfere. If the bankers expected Charles Koch to go along with the conventional wisdom of their time, then they, like so many outsiders, did not understand him. Beneath his low-key veneer, Charles Koch was, at his core, a fighter. He had unmovable ideas about how things should be, and he did not back down when challenged. When he was challenged by his own brothers for control of Koch Industries, he fought them in a bitter legal battle that lasted decades. When he was challenged by members of a powerful labor union during his first years as CEO, he fought them even as they committed an act of industrial sabotage that nearly destroyed Koch's oil refinery. When the FBI and the U.S. Department of Justice launched a criminal investigation into Koch Industries' oil gathering business, Charles Koch fought them with every legal and political tool at his disposal. When a liberal Congress and President Barack Obama sought to impose regulations on the fossil fuel industry to control greenhouse gas emissions, Charles Koch fought them in ways that changed U.S. politics. In each of these fights, Charles Koch prevailed. When Charles Koch dismissed the bankers in 1981, it was just a small skirmish in the larger war to control Koch Industries. After prevailing in that fight, he created a company that was true to his vision. He avoided the snares that entangled many publicly traded companies that report their financial results to investors every 3 months. Koch Industries didn't have to think quarter to quarter. The company thinks year to year. An internal think tank and deal-making committee called the Development Group will sometimes think through a business deal on a timeline measured in decades. This long-term view made Koch more nimble where other companies stumbled. In 2003, for example, Koch Industries bought a group of money-losing fertilizer plants when no publicly traded company was willing to take the risk. Today, those plants are as profitable as a broken ATM machine that spews out cash around the clock. Unlike publicly traded companies, Koch Industries does not pay out rich in dividends to investors. Charles Koch insists on reinvesting at least 90% of the company's profits, fueling its constant expansion. This strategy laid the foundation for decades of continuous growth. Koch Industries expanded continuously by purchasing other companies and branching out into new industries. It specialized in the kind of businesses that are indispensable to modern civilization, but which most consumers never directly encounter. The company is embedded in the hidden infrastructure of everyday life. Millions of people use Koch's products without ever seeing Koch's name attached. Koch refines and distributes fossil fuels, from gasoline to jet fuel, on which the global economy is dependent. Koch is the world's third largest producer of nitrogen fertilizer, which is the cornerstone of our modern food system. Koch makes the synthetic materials used in baby diapers, waistbands, and carpets. It makes the chemicals used for plastic bottles and pipes. It owns Georgia Pacific, which makes the wall panels, beams, and plywood required to build homes and office buildings. It makes napkins, paper towels, stationery, newspaper, and personal hygiene products. Koch Industries owns a network of commodities trading offices in Houston, Moscow, Geneva, and elsewhere, which are the circulatory system of modern finance. The book, Kochland, by Christopher Leonard.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
No one may take
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. We've been talking about Trump being the catalyst for war and authoritarianism around the planet and here in the United States, the assault on democracy and how democracy is an anti-war force, how capitalism and the Republican Party have essentially destroyed Christianity or in the process of it, kind of dismantling it. And we'll continue all those conversations. But I want to take this out a little bit. I want to expand this somewhat and dig into neurological differences. I mean, there is this narrative that attention deficit hyperactive disorder is a psychological illness, that people with it are broken, that it is a defect, that it is a disorder. I mean, it has the word disorder in its name. But just think about this for a minute. The principal characteristics are three things. And by the way, the reason I want to dig into this, I think that this, you know, in a way, in a number of ways actually, ties into all the other things we've been talking about, and I'll pull all this together at the end. But anyhow, there's three cardinal characteristics of ADHD. The first is impulsivity, or actually the first is distractibility, easily distracted. You know, Johnny is sitting in his classroom and there's a bug crawling across the ceiling while, you know, his teacher is talking, and instead of listening to his teacher, Johnny is looking at the bug going, oh, what a cute distraction. Distractibility, number one. Number two, impulsivity. You know, Johnny just blurts stuff out. Engage mouth before engaging brain. And number three, risk-taking behavior, or a high level of need for stimulation in life. And back in the 80s, when late 70s, early 80s, when Louise and I were running this community for abused kids, and then later when one of our own kids was diagnosed with ADHD, I wrote a paper about this in 1980 on the Feingold hypothesis. I got to know Ben Feingold quite well. His book, Why Your Child is Hyperactive, had just been published in 1978, as I recall. Went out to San Francisco, met with him. My paper was published in the Journal of Orthomolecular Psychiatry. And the theory that I came up with, and you know, my most recent book on this is ADHD, Hunter in a Farmer's World. The theory that I came up with was that these kids are not broken at all. And it's not just kids, by the way, it's adults too. I'm one of them. That these kids are not broken at all, that there is an ecological niche a sociological niche, a practical in life niche for people who are easily distracted, impulsive, and like risk. And that is what, in my opinion, sustained the human race for 300,000 years when we were hunter-gatherers. You know, if a hunter is going through the forest looking for lunch, and they're not scanning their environment constantly, noticing everything around them all the time, they're going to miss that flash of light over there that's that bunny that's going to be lunch, or that flash of light over there that's a bear that wants to make them lunch, and they'll either starve or get weeded out of the gene pool. So distractibility is actually an asset in a hunting-gathering society. Similarly, if you're going through the forest and you're chasing the rabbit, and suddenly a deer goes by, you don't have time to pull out a pad and a pen and say, let's do a risk-benefit analysis. Let's see here. Bunny, easier to catch. Deer, more meat. Which shall it be? And by that time, they're both gone. You have to make a decision and be engaging in it really before you even realize you've thought about it. And that's the definition of impulsivity, is behavior precedes cognition. In other words, we make decisions at an unconscious level and begin engaging in the behavior before at a conscious level we even start thinking about it. That's impulsivity. And then this need for a high level of stimulation. Well, you know, in a hunting-gathering world, somebody who wakes up in the morning and says, you know, I don't want to leave the cave. There's things out there that want to eat me. What's going to happen to that person? They're going to die, right? They'll starve. But somebody who wakes up in the morning and says, you know what sounds like fun? Going out there where there's things that want to eat me as much as I want to eat them, and finding food, right? And, you know, beating the system, as it were. Outwitting the predators. Now, about 10,000 years ago, we switched, and not all of us, but what has eventually become the majority of us, switched from hunting-gathering to agriculture. There was a pastoral piece in there that lasted probably 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 years that doesn't get much discussion, and that's a whole kind of tangent. But, you know, basically we went from being hunter-gatherers to being farmers. Now, if you're a farmer and you're distractible, you know, you're out planting things and a butterfly goes by and, oh, what a cute butterfly. I wonder where that, oh, look, there's a tree over there with honey in it. I think I'll go gather. And you forget to plant those seeds, right? Distractibility would be a liability. You have to be able to focus, right? Farmers are out there picking bugs off plants, bug after bug, bug after bug, day after day, hour after hour, week after week, month after month, picking all those bugs off those plants. And you have to have a mind that's organized in a way to say, oh, that's just fine with me. So distractibility becomes a liability in a farming society. Impulsivity becomes a liability in a farming society. It's an asset for hunter-gatherers. It's a liability for farmers. You can't say, oh, that wheat grew really well last year, but that was kind of boring. Let's plant ragweed this year and see what happens. Everybody dies when the crop comes in and you can't eat it. You have to have patience. You have to think things through. You have to plan literally a year in advance. One of the things I've noticed about people with ADHD is they have a hard time thinking even a year out, right? Everything is now, right? It's like living in the present constantly. Very Buddhist, but not very farmer. And then, you know, risk aversion. Farmers settle down. They live in the same place for years at a time. If they wanted to take risks, you know, they'd leave. And of course, that's what happened. You know, I think that, you know, you had Europeans who came to North America, and a lot of them were ADHD, and they settled, you know, up and down the East Coast. And then those who were the most distractible among them, the most ADHD among them, the most hunter among them, they moved out to the Midwest, and then the most hunter among them moved to the Rocky Mountains, and then the most hunter among them moved all the way to the West Coast, and then they hit the Pacific Ocean, and that's why we have Hollywood. There is, by the way, an association, a clear association. I posited this in my first book on this topic back in 1996, and it has now been demonstrated. In fact, Dr. Richard Silberstein wrote a paper that was published in a peer-reviewed journal just 3 or 4 months ago, citing me as the source for this, suggesting that there is a positive correlation between ADHD and creativity. And it doesn't have to cripple somebody. I mean, Thomas Edison, for example, who I think is a classic example of somebody with ADHD, when he was 7 years old, his school teacher told his mother that he would never learn anything and never amount to anything. And she told the school teacher where he could put it, and she became his teacher. He was homeschooled by his mother. She reorganized his life to give him a high level of stimulation and allow his creativity to run wild. And he changed the world as a result of it. Ben Franklin, another, I think, classic example of ADHD. And there's a bunch of them. And then we have to ask ourselves, you know, if roughly 10%, and it depends on whose numbers you're looking at. Some are saying 2, 3, 4%. Others are saying as many as 10% of our kids are diagnosable as ADHD. How does nature make that kind of a mistake? It's not a mistake. And back in the 90s, when I first was writing about this, I hypothesized that we would eventually find that there's actually a gene associated with ADHD, and that gene would be found in large, well represented among indigenous hunter-gatherer people, and would be less well represented among people who had lived as farmers for thousands of years. And they have now identified, it's not just one gene, it's a number of them. They're all the dopamine genes, the DR, the primary dopamine receptor genes, the D2 and the D4 gene, and specific alleles, things that cause the gene to express in different ways, are overrepresented and underrepresented in various populations. They've found this. I mean, my theory has now been demonstrated to be true. And what this does is it gives us the solution to, what do you do about this? Little Johnny is distractible, impulsive, and likes to take risks, but he's in a classroom that was designed for farmers. Because, the Industrial Revolution is just an extension of the agricultural revolution. Instead of picking bugs off plants, we're putting bolts on screws all day long. But it's still that same boring stuff. And so you got to get people ready for that. So you have this boring school that's really run like a factory where you break everything into little pieces, individual unique subjects, and you teach things in order and all this kind of stuff. And it doesn't work for a lot of kids. So what do? We give them drugs to turn them into farmers. How's that useful? They're going to be hunters for the whole rest of their lives. Now, I'll acknowledge there are some kids who have ADHD so severely that they can't function in any kind of school without some kind of medication. There is a small, and I'm not sure that that's even necessarily real ADHD in those kids. And I'm not saying, oh, don't ever give kids drugs, or adults for that matter. I take drugs myself. I took a cup of coffee this morning. I had a glass of wine last night. These are drugs. We use drugs in our culture. Stimulants and sedatives. But before we start passing out pills to kids, shouldn't we be thinking about making our schools more hunter-friendly? I mean, isn't that a reasonable thing to do? Not particularly now that we know that there's actually a positive correlation between creativity and ADHD. Why would we want to suppress it? Except for the convenience of the school system. Let's instead improve our schools. Let's make schools that actually work for these kind of kids. And then we get to adults. And I'll pick that up right after this break. That's a whole fascinating story, which is kind of the story of my life. So we'll be back with that in just a moment. It's 18 minutes past the hour.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Do you have ADD? Do you know somebody who does? Does your kid? How did that work out? Have you figured out ways through it, around it? And welcome back. We've got a lot of, conversations left over from our previous hours as well. So let's just get back into that. Susan in Saratoga Springs, New York, you wanted to get back to religion?
Oh, yeah, thanks, Tom, for taking my call. How are you?
I'm well. I hope you are too.
My father was an old Republican, and I do agree with your statement regarding the Reagan years as being the beginning of the breakup of the middle class in our country and corporatism rise. But, he always said that, opiates of the masses is what religion is. And
which was Karl Marx's phrase.
Catholic.
Yeah.
Yes. And, I was raised Catholic, but I am an atheist now. I totally believe that religion has been used by the Illuminati as a way to control the masses. And basically my statement about that would be that I don't understand why we can sit here and talk all this on TV or on streaming, of course, and so few people are aware of it. I mean, when I go out, and also on the manic thing, I am manic, okay, and I'm very highly creative. I have a very high IQ, and I've always had issues in business world being a female because I actually say what I feel in a very, very conservative way. But being an intelligent woman, it's been very difficult for me to really assimilate into our society. And I do have friends that are intelligent, writers and whatever. But I think mania is also another form of ADHD.
May well be.
That brings to our society many, many gifts that should be appreciated and not drugged away.
Yeah, it may well be. And some people are crippled by bipolar disorder is generally how it's referred to these days. Other people are not, and some people just have really up days and times or weeks or months and down times and weeks and months. And in fact, I think that you can even make an argument that depression, the downside of mania, is also adaptive because people who are depressed tend to separate themselves from the rest of society. And when we lived tribally, they would be the people who lived on the periphery of the tribe. They don't sleep well. They're constantly, concerned about what's going on around them. They would be the lookouts, the early warning system. But back to your point about religion, you said that you thought that the Illuminati was using religion. I don't think that we have to go that big. I think that Jerry Falwell Jr. is using religion to exploit the masses. I think that Franklin Graham is using religion to exploit the masses. I think these megachurch and in every case they're exploiting the masses for their own benefit. I mean, these guys have become multi-millionaires.
And, of course, they don't pay any taxes, Mr. Hartmann.
Right. There you go, Susan. You're absolutely right.
And neither do educational institutions such as Harvard and Yale.
You're right. Yeah.
Educational systems do not pay taxes.
Unless they're for-profit.
So that's another issue that should be taxed. I think educational, higher ed, educational institutions such as those should be taxed.
Well, I think you can make a strong case that they, at the very least, should pay property taxes. But income taxes. But I'm all for charging at the very least property taxes to churches. Susan, thank you for the call. Nice to hear from you. It's 22 minutes past the hour. We'll be right back. Hey, here's the Thom Hartmann Program, exposing the con in conservative. Stick around. We'll be right back. Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere. We're talking about ADHD kids, although I think in my hunter-farmer story I was explaining, all those examples were adults. So how does this play out in the lives of adults? It turns out that in our society, we actually have jobs that are really good jobs for people who are farmers. That's fairly obvious. The people who just, want to put the screw on the bolt, one after another, after another, after another, all day long, just standing there on the assembly line, or on the office equivalent of same, processing insurance forms or whatever it may be. People who just have the ability to be there and focus and, 8 hours doing one repetitive thing after another. There's plenty of farmer jobs out there. But it turns out that there's also a lot of good hunter jobs out there. You need a little bit of both skills. But if you lean farther toward hunter, that's the investigative journalist, as opposed to the maybe the person who's in the studio just reporting the news every day. The person who wants to get out there and dig into the details. That's typically the hunter. Every investigative journalist I have ever known well, I think I could probably diagnose with ADHD. Detectives. Again, there's two different kinds of private detectives, or police detectives for that matter. There's the people who do the very careful, thoughtful book kind of work and research stuff, and then there's the people who like to get out there on the streets and just, dig into things. So the advice that I think that we need to be giving to our children, now that this has gone from just theory to actual science, the advice we need to be giving to our children about, what do you want to do when you grow up is, obviously find what you're passionate about and follow it, but make sure that it's something that is never going to be boring or so boring or so difficult because your brain's not wired that way that you can't sustain it. You want something that you would love doing for a long period of time. For me, that was being an entrepreneur. I've started, a whole bunch of businesses in my life, and 5 of them have been successful. 4 of them were quite successful. A couple of them failed. But being an entrepreneur was my thing. And now, doing this radio and TV program. Great stuff for hunters. And, I'm a member of that tribe. So, tell your kids there are things out there, and some of them pay really well. Again, among the entrepreneurs in this world, some of the very successful, very wealthy ones, you'll find a lot of hunters in this farmer's world. On the other hand, if your kid is a farmer, direct them in that direction. So we'll be back with your calls and thoughts right after this. It is coming up on 28 minutes past the hour here on the Thom Hartmann Program, the True People's Media.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
We'll be back with your calls in just a minute.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Vince Houghton's Nuking the Moon and Other Intelligence Schemes and Military Plots Left on the Drawing Board. This is Chapter 7, Operation Northwoods. On April 17, 1961, more than 1,400 Cuban exiles forming the Brigada de Asalto 2506 landed on the beaches of Cuba at Playa Girón in the Bahia de Cojinos, the Bay of Pigs. Their mission was to overthrow the regime of Fidel Castro, Cuba's increasingly communist leader, who had himself overthrown the regime of American ally Batista just 2 years before. A communist leader just 90 miles from Key West was a rather painful thorn in the side of the newly inaugurated President John F. Kennedy, and his ouster was considered a high national security priority, as it had been for Kennedy's predecessor, Dwight Eisenhower. The invasion was backed by the U.S. government and the CIA. We can argue why the Bay of Pigs invasion failed until we're blue in the face, and many people still do. For many in the Cuban exile community, the mission failed because JFK refused to give American naval and air support, elements called in for the original plan developed by the Eisenhower administration. Maybe this is true. problem here is that we begin to descend into the realm of the counterfactuals, the if-onlys and what-ifs, things that we are doing our damnedest to avoid. Look, I've met a lot of the Cubans who took part in that invasion, many of whom are permanently settled in or around Miami, my hometown. They are impressive men, and I wouldn't put anything past them. If they say they could have kicked out Castro with U.S. naval and air support, who am I to argue? But I still will, because things are much more complicated from an intelligence perspective. Despite the lack of air and naval support, and despite the intensity and desire of the Cuban exile forces, it would have been immeasurably difficult to overcome one of the most problematic aspects of the entire invasion. Castro not only knew they were coming, he knew when and where they were coming. A combination of piss-poor information security, or in today's parlance, InfoSec, with the ability of Cuban intelligence to infiltrate the Miami exile community meant that the secret mission to free Cuba of Castro was anything but secret. It's not like this was a huge surprise for the CIA or the U.S. military. The Cuban intelligence service was very good, and some in the exile community had loose lips. In this environment, it was nearly impossible to conduct effective counterintelligence and keep the invasion secret. Most telling of all, the Soviets had literally broadcast their knowledge of the mission 4 days before it happened. On April 13th, Radio Moscow released an English-language newscast in which they predicted an invasion of Cuba by CIA-trained exiles within the week. It seems they were trying to warn us against carrying out the invasion, a type of deterrence through propaganda. Hey, we know you're coming, so perhaps now is not a good time for your secret operation. Clearly, that didn't work. The blowback from the failed mission was significant on multiple levels. More than 100 members of the 2506 Brigade were killed in combat, along with 4 American volunteer pilots from the Alabama Air National Guard, who were contracted by the CIA. Hundreds more in Cuba would be executed in the days and weeks following the invasion, as Castro eliminated anyone suspected of abetting the exiles. More than 1,200 of the brigade would be captured by the Cuban government, and some of those members were subsequently executed. The Kennedy administration was embarrassed by the failed mission. The U.S. government looked inept and failing to maintain order even in its own backyard. In the zero-sum game of the Cold War, where victory for one of the superpowers was defeat for the other, this was a huge win for the Soviets. Not to mention that the invasion pushed Castro even more firmly into the Soviet sphere of influence. And as far as the strength of the regime was concerned, the Bay of Pigs invasion did the exact opposite of what was intended. It made Castro's regime more powerful than ever before. The operation was a great political victory for the Cubans at home and abroad. Castro was a hero in the eyes of his people for defeating the Yankee invasion and was able to consolidate his power. The fiasco also elevated the Cuban government to a newfound global status, transforming communist Cuba from a grieved little country to an equal in the eyes of the world. In fact, Argentinian physician turned Cuban revolutionary Ernesto Che Guevara actually thanked the United States for the failed invasion. The CIA bore the brunt of the blame for the failed mission. President Kennedy fired CIA Director Allen Dulles, along with Deputy Director Charles Cabell and Deputy Director for Plans Richard M. Bissell, the 3 men who made up the core of the agency's leadership, particularly in the realm of covert action. Kennedy also removed, at least temporarily, major paramilitary operations from the purview of the CIA. For more than a decade, CIA had been the agency with primary responsibility for paramilitary covert operations, but now it was benched. Into the void leapt the U.S. military. In June 1961, about 2 months after the Bay of Pigs, President Kennedy approved National Security Action Memoranda 55, 56, and 57, which codified the shift in paramilitary responsibility from the CIA to the Pentagon. Nothing else really changed. The U.S. government was still looking for ways to oust Castro from power, just through a different government agency. By autumn, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations, Brigadier General Edward Lansdale, a legendary intelligence officer, or infamous, or both, depending on your perspective, was asked to brainstorm ideas to get rid of Fidel. He didn't disappoint. In February 1962, Lansdale provided a document titled Possible Actions to Provoke, Harass, or Disrupt Cuba. Some of the actions are pretty good, some are quite silly, and some are downright abhorrent. The book is Nuking the Moon by Vince Houghton. Thom Hartmann Cruise will be sailing in July of 2020. The 7-day Oceania cruise will be going to Bermuda, and I'll be hosting onboard events about the topics of the day. More info at thomhartmann.com or 800-856-1155. Welcome back. 34 minutes past the hour. We've got a lot on our plate, from peace and war, Democrats and Republicans, corporate buyouts, the sellout by the Supreme Court this morning of the voters of Michigan. In a 5-4 decision that Elena Kagan said was, she just ripped it apart. But hey, it's like it's a 5-4 decision. And, with the Trumpkins all going, yeah, gerrymandering, good. Everything else bad. Gary in Philadelphia. Hey, Gary, what's on your mind today?
Hi, how are you today? Thanks for taking my call.
You're welcome. What's up?
So, you were just talking about ADHD, and I really just called to say thank you. I was the poster boy for ADHD back in the day when they called it minimal brain dysfunction, and he's just hyperactive, or he's just a little bit different, or he just can't sit still in our class.
I remember all those labels being applied to me.
Yeah, exactly. So because of ADHD, A Different Perspective, which was so vastly different than all of the other books that were being written at the time by Barkley and a lot of the other guys.
Oh, yeah.
You changed my life. And I wanted to call to say thank you. And I've been listening to your show for a while and going, I really ought to call that guy and say thanks.
Well, that's very kind of you, Gary.
That book actually made me, helped me to appreciate what I was. Because up until that point, I was just different and weird and unaccepted and stupid. And I knew I was not. I've had a lovely, lovely life. I've done a bazillion things. I have skills in so many areas that people just go, wow, how does he know all that? It's because, just like you said, ADHD people, if they're not interested, you know what? They're not interested. But if they are interested, they suck that up like a Hoover.
Yep.
And
hyper-focus.
I sucked up, hyper-focus. And I sucked up a lot of stuff like a Hoover. I also ended up working to build a charter school specifically for kids with ADHD and very high functioning on the spectrum.
That's great.
And we opened for 2 years, and we got shut down by the local districts who chose not to love us and were threatened by us. And I just want you to know that through me, your book saved other lives as well.
That's
so
wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. And that book, by the way, ADD, A Different Perception, is out of print. But I took that book and went through, brought it up to date, added all the new science, wrote 2 new chapters, one about sleep and the other, I forget what the other was. And it just came out last month. It came out a few weeks ago, actually, under a new title, ADHD, Hunter in a Farmer's World. So that book is newly available.
I read it. I read that, and I was specifically interested in the sections on sleep because I saw it in the index, and I'm also the poster boy for that.
Yeah, people with ADHD, 68% of people with ADHD have sleep disorders. And
exactly.
And it's because, we're high energy people, and, our baseline is just, much, much higher than the average person. And so, and therefore a lot of these folks end up, getting strung out on sleeping pills and things like that. And there are a lot of good non-pharmaceutical solutions, basically, that I talk about in the book.
I use plenty of those.
Yeah.
I'm glad my name's not out there right now.
Yeah, I get it, and people also self-medicate with alcohol, and that's not particularly useful. So, anyhow, Gary, I got to move along, but thank you for the call and thanks for your kind words.
And thank you.
Really appreciate it. You're welcome. Lori in Portland, Oregon. Hey, Lori, what's up?
Hi, Tom. I wanted to tell you that about 15 years ago here in Portland, I enrolled my kids in a completely alternative school run by volunteers and a small staff. And there was a higher percentage of young boys than girls that enrolled. And most of the time it was boys that were having trouble in school and paying attention and sitting still. And this school, I believe, is still running today and successfully. And one of the things that worked so well, these were super creative kids. We had 13-year-old authors and kids that were leaders that could get a whole group of kids together to plan. And one of the lovely things about it was that it was child-led, so they got to choose what they were interested in and be taught in that subject. But I think what made it work really, really well is when the kids would get sick of sitting or restless, all they had to do was get a parent, volunteer, or a staff to go outside. And they were allowed to play dodgeball, run around and play games, climb trees, burn off a bunch of energy, and then come back in and go back to whatever they were doing.
Yeah.
And all of the kids in this school literally loved going to school every day.
Yeah, now there's a movement in public education as a consequence of this kind of top-down pressure, that comes from whatever, to do away with recess. I mean, that's crazy, Lori.
It is crazy. And I've seen it firsthand. I watched these kids who were considered, unproductive or disruptive kids that just flourished in this school.
Yeah. Great.
And so, yeah, I wish we would see more of that.
And this is what we ended up doing. One of our kids went through public school. One of our kids we homeschooled, and one of our kids went to a private school that was specifically where the kids ran the school. It was kind of a Summerhill school with high academic standards, and they all worked, but they all adapted, to their individual neurochemistry. Lori, thanks for the call, and thanks for sharing your story. It's great to hear from you. Larry in Santa Monica. Hey, Larry, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom. I just want to piggyback on the previous conversation you were having about the evangelicals. Yeah. So I'm a former pastor for almost 20 years. I've been out of the ministry now for about 6 or 7 years. But to truly understand this movement in this country, you have to go back a few years. You probably remember a man by the name of Oral Roberts, who was on the TV in the 1950s.
I remember him well, yeah.
He was a faith healer. So this whole, what they call now prosperity message, actually started in this subgroup of Protestants called Pentecostals, beginning with Oral Roberts, who taught that God could miraculously heal you. And quite frankly, a lot of people did receive some sort of physical relief, and they attributed it to Oral Roberts' ministry. Well, his protege was Kenneth Hagin. Mm-hmm. And Kenneth Hagin not only said that God could miraculously heal you, but God could also give you miracle money.
Right.
So Kenneth Hagin became popular in the 1970s. In the 1970s, he met a man named Dr. K.C. Price, who was a black Protestant minister in Los Angeles. And Dr. Price, Fred Price, studied underneath Dr. Hagin, and together they actually propagated basically around the country this so-called, what we call now the prosperity message. Back in those days, it was actually called the faith gospel. And there was a huge split in the Protestant church about this faith gospel, again, because it had its roots in the Pentecostal church. So you had mainline organizations like what you grew up in, the Methodists. You had Presbyterians and other mainline groups who stood staunchly opposed to this so-called new doctrine. But then you had other groups who considered themselves a little bit more independent and not doctrinally, not denominationally aligned, who fell into line with it. So you have all of these competing ideas and doctrines. Fast forward to George Bush and his election, who down in Texas becomes converted in a Methodist church, whose actual pastor during that time had started sort of being lulled over into the prosperity message. And so George Bush, in many ways, coalesced these sort of strands of evangelical Christianity, bringing together those really fundamentalist strands, which had their doctrinal beliefs about the end times, and they're very conservative in their viewpoints. and then bringing in these Pentecostal beliefs, speaking about prosperity and commerce. And,
well,
so
and you know, in 1980 and 84, George W. Bush was the principal advisor to the Reagan campaigns on bringing Christians into the GOP.
Exactly right, because his brand of Christianity was not the brand of Christianity of his father. His father's brand of Christianity was they were Episcopalian.
Right.
George Bush's brand of Christianity were this sort of neo-Protestant, faith gospel sort of prosperity.
So
gospel.
Larry, we're gonna hit a break here shortly. Where do you think Christianity, Protestant Christianity anyway, is at right now? I mean, is this prosperity gospel? It seems to me like it's just turned into a scam, basically, and they're milking people. I remember when Oral Roberts said, you know, God's going to take me up if you don't help me raise $50 million or whatever it was, on the other hand, Louise and I went to see Catherine Coleman once, and the woman who we had stood outside for 4 hours waiting to get into the church with, who was deaf, was healed right in front of me. I mean, it was shocking. She started screaming. All of a sudden, she could hear. It might have been a psychological disorder. Who knows? You know, it might have been a genuine miracle. But you know, I mean, but where do you think that this is going now?
I think what you observed probably was a genuine miracle. I, as a Christian, am a believer that things supernaturally can happen. But with that said, this infusion of this everybody can get rich gospel has been a pollutant. And I think that where we're at right now is a breaking point, because the what they've sold to Christianity, the prosperity strand of evangelicals, actually has fallen apart several times, and it's not really working for them. So what you have now is a pushback of just a hardcore doctrinalist of them. Let's wait for Jesus to come back and destroy the earth, and then we'll start all over again.
And then they get behind people like Donald Trump, who are essentially warmongers, thinking that, well, that war in Israel is going to be a good thing.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, that's which leads us right to disaster. Larry, thank you for the call. Great to hear from you. We'll be back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
Back with more of your calls in just a moment. It's 46 minutes past the hour. Welcome back. Let's see here. Alina in Seattle. Hey, Alina, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. I'm not an expert on religion, but I want to say about the election next year, what you were talking about in the first hour.
Mm-hmm.
I think we can't rely on any one politician to save us.
Yeah, I agree.
We are the answer we've been waiting for. So, yeah, fingers crossed. I'm a Bernie supporter. If he gets elected, Democrats take the Senate. We still need to fight like hell to get the Green New Deal passed and fix the Supreme Court and everything. So if we win that one, it'll be just the beginning. I don't want to have any more faith in politicians. I did that when Barack Obama was elected. I'm not making that mistake again.
I think your statement that we are the ones we've been waiting for is the key to the whole thing, that if we don't have what Bernie calls a political revolution, what I would call is grassroots bottom-up politics, if we don't have a large enough base of people who are actually engaged and actually show up and participate, that this 40-year campaign that the billionaire class launched against democracy with the beginning with the Reagan administration, and arguably beginning in 1971 with the Powell memo, and then Richard Nixon putting Powell on the court in 72, and then the Buckley decision in 76, and First National Bank in 78, saying that billionaires and corporations can own politicians, which led us to Reagan. That revolution will not be turned back, and the end result, where we will get to and we're very close to right now is something that resembles fascism. And we're seeing the rise of what I would call fascism all around the world, the corporate state, or a state run by oligarchs. And I'm very concerned.
Yes, what I want to say is also, you mentioned Koch brothers launching another effort to dismantle what we have left of the social welfare system.
Right.
The punchline is work makes you free or something like that. That's
Arbeit macht frei. That was the slogan over Auschwitz. Work makes free. Yes. Their actual phrase, and I'll quote it, is the redeeming power of work. I had completely forgotten that was the slogan over. Maybe it wasn't Auschwitz. Maybe it was Dachau.
Auschwitz and other Nazi camps too, not just Auschwitz.
Yeah, because Louise and I visited Dachau, and I think it was Dachau, but whatever, which is near. Was it near Nuremberg? I think, south of there. Anyway, yeah. And this is their sales pitch now. If we cut people off from their benefits, they will want to go to work. And I think if you cut people off from their benefits, particularly if there's not work available to them, or at least not meaningful work available to them, you destroy them. You're going to be fueling, more addiction and more crime and more despair, and more broken families. And I mean, we need to give people, you can't pull yourself up by your bootstraps if you don't have bootstraps. And there's got to be a starting point. There's got to be a baseline here. Alina, thank you so much for the call. It's great to hear from you, and thank you for listening to KBCS. We'll be back. It's 10 minutes before the hour here on the Thom Hartmann Program, helping you win the water cooler wars. We'll be right back. Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. And let's see here, Robin in Kingston, Washington. Hey, Robin, what's up?
Hi, Tom. How are you? Your favorite Patco air traffic controller who
hi, Robin.
who need a little bit of ADHD to make that work. We stop scanning, we're in trouble.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
I thought you'd like that.
Yeah, I do like that.
Anyways, actually, I have a comment that ties a bunch of things in. Why religion is descending. I believe this. I'm sort of atheistic or agnostic. I believe that religion is a process that keeps men in control, and that entire element is ending. And the Gutenberg press thing still was able to be withheld from women, but the internet is not. So the internet is this era's Gutenberg press, and that's why women are just standing up.
Well,
and an example.
Go ahead.
An example of this would be Kashama Swant, socialist in Seattle. 4 or 5 years ago, when she started out, I would drift over. I'm on the other side of the sound, but I'd support and do what I could to help out. And I kept on encouraging her to form a new party, a new socialist party called the Eco-Socialist Party. Economic socialism and ecological socialism. And I told her 5 or 6 times she didn't do that. And then all of a sudden, blink, all of a sudden somebody has invented that, and that is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez with the Green New Deal. That's exactly what that is. So I just wanted to tie in a few things that you have been talking about, and clearly the Green New Deal is the citizens' pushback to corporate and bankster control of a capitalistic society. So this is you have it right. This is a battleground, and so stand up or lay down. So get engaged, everybody. So this is a blast. Also, just wrapping it up. Once you open up the discussion about politicians, the Democratic candidates, I'm going to tie in Buttigieg. My observation is that Pete Buttigieg is a Manchurian candidate coming out of the military-industrial complex, and he is to the left what John McCain is to the right. Military intelligence. McCain wasn't gay, I don't think. But he speaks smoothly with Harvard speak. So you will find out that Buttigieg is in position to get the droppings from either whether Joe Biden failed or whether he could be part of the particular campaign.
Yeah, clearly both Mayor Pete's strategy and Amy Klobuchar's Senator Klobuchar's strategy is, if Joe Biden falls, I'm the guy or the woman. I'm the person to catch that. The story which has got a lot of people going, whoa, that came out today that Mark Zuckerberg and his wife were personally advising Buttigieg's campaign on who they should hire. Is, I think, giving a lot of people a lot of pause. And maybe, hey, there's nothing wrong with taking advice from smart, wealthy people, on the one hand. On the other hand, is there more to it than that? I think a lot of people are waiting to find out. I'm not sure I'm ready to call him a stalking horse, but Robin, I absolutely get what you're talking about. Thank you for the call. Dave in Buffalo, New York. Hey, Dave, what's up?
Thanks, Tom. Quickly, there's so much about religion. The beginning of religion and why it's so difficult to leave. We were once pagans, and before there was God or Jesus, there was just us, pagans. We were hunters and gatherers, you're right. And what happened was a group of people wanted to control people in general. They had an idea about religion. And so what they saw was that these hunters and gatherers during the winter solstice were always celebrating. And what they did was they didn't have a date for Jesus' birthday. So what they decided to do, I'm sorry the show is ending.
Yeah,
Tom.
but I know your story, Dave. They took the solstice, and the priest went up and lit the tree on fire and said, I'm going to bring the sun back. And the next day, the days got longer, and everybody said, he did it again. And all they had was a little stone calendar to figure out what day to do it, but that's all they needed. I'm with you. Thank you so much for being with us today. We'll be back tomorrow, same bat time, same bat place. And in the meantime, don't forget democracy is not a spectator sport. It's not something that falls out of the sky. It's not something that we just sit around and watch. No, it requires all of us to participate. So please tell your friends about our program, share the word, and get active. Get out there, get active, tag you're it.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.
back.